The plate of cornbread she slid under the fence cost her nothing but trouble. The empire he built to repay her cost him his humanity. The cornbread cost her everything, but it gave him a future worth $89 million. Michelle James, 9 years old, saw the dying boy at the chain-link fence in the Riverside projects. Her family ate there every night in her grandmother's cramped kitchen. It was the only safe meal they could count on in a neighborhood where gunshots were the dinner bell. But this morning, a skeletal mixed-race child lay collapsed against the rusty fence behind the playground, too weak to even cry out. Her grandmother had cooked that cornbread for the whole family, their only breakfast. Miss even one meal and they'd all go hungry until Grandma's next paycheck came through. Michelle had school to get to, chores waiting, a little brother depending on her. Everything depended on her keeping her head down and minding her business like everyone else on the block. But the boy was dying. She could see it in his hollow, dark eyes that seemed too old for his face. She fed him anyway. Cornbread wrapped in foil every single morning for 3 months straight. Nobody asked her to do it. Nobody thanked her. Most of the neighborhood kids called her stupid for wasting food on a ghost boy who didn't even speak proper English. She did it because her grandmother had taught her that when you see someone dying and you have even a small thing that could save them, you give it no matter the cost. Even in a place where the rule was, see nothing, say nothing, survive. The boy's name was Suck. Just Suck. When men in black SUVs finally came to take him away, suits and sunglasses looking like FBI in a neighborhood that feared badges and guns, Suck made Michelle a promise that seemed impossible. I will find you again when I become somebody. I will buy this whole block for you. I swear it. His English was broken, his voice hoarse from weeks of near starvation. Michelle thought he was delirious, fever dreaming, a dying street kid making promises he couldn't possibly keep. But before the men dragged him into the car, she gave him something precious. A rusted subway token her late father had given her before he was killed. The last thing she had of him. She pressed it into Suck's trembling palm. So you remember, she whispered as he was pulled away, so you know somebody loved you. The SUVs disappeared into the smog and traffic. The neighborhood forgot about the ghost boy within a week. Michelle never forgot. Not the way his fingers had gripped that token like it was made of gold. Not the way he'd looked back at her through the tinted window with eyes that burned with something she couldn't name. 20 years later, those eyes would return, but they wouldn't belong to a starving boy anymore. They would belong to a monster. A monster who burned down the entire underworld just to keep a promise made by a child who had nothing. Michelle James had learned to walk past trouble without looking at it directly. That was the first rule of survival in the Riverside projects. Keep your eyes on your own feet, your business to yourself, and your mouth shut unless spoken to. At 9 years old, she'd already mastered the art of being invisible. But the boy behind the fence made that impossible. She'd noticed him 3 days ago on her way to school. Just a shadow at first, hunched against the chain link that separated the cracked basketball court from the abandoned lot where rusty shopping carts went to die. The other kids streamed past him like water around a stone, their backpacks bouncing, their voices loud with the kind of careless noise that came from not yet understanding that the projects swallowed people whole. Michelle had looked, just once, just long enough to see that he wasn't from the neighborhood. His clothes were wrong, too clean at first, like he'd been dropped there from somewhere else. His face was wrong too, mixed, maybe Korean or Chinese, with skin that hadn't yet adapted to the brutal summer sun that turned the concrete into a griddle. The older boys called him Ghost Boy because he didn't talk, didn't move much, just sat there with his back against the fence like he was waiting for something that would never come. By day 3, his clothes weren't clean anymore. They hung off his frame like burial shrouds, and Michelle could count his ribs through the thin fabric of his shirt even from 15 feet away. His lips were cracked and bleeding. His eyes had gone dull, fixed on nothing, the way her uncle's eyes had looked right before the ambulance came and didn't come back. That morning, Grandma Ruth had packed Michelle's lunch in the kitchen that smelled like pine sol and decades of grease that wouldn't scrub out no matter how hard you tried. 2 pieces of fried chicken left over from last night's dinner, wrapped in aluminum foil that Grandma would wash and reuse because nothing got thrown away in their house. A bruised apple. A sandwich bag with 6 saltine crackers inside. "You eat all of that, baby," Grandma Ruth had said, her voice carrying that tone that meant the pantry was getting empty again and payday was still 4 days away. "Don't be giving none of it away to them kids at school. You need your strength." "Yes, ma'am," Michelle had said, because you didn't argue with Grandma Ruth. Not about food, not about anything. But then she'd walked past the fence and seen the boy wasn't sitting up anymore. He was lying on his side in the dirt, curled into himself like something already dead, and Michelle felt something crack open in her chest. Something that made her stop walking even though the school bell was going to ring in 10 minutes, and Mr. Patterson gave detention to anyone who came in late. She looked around. The usual morning flow of people moved past her like she was invisible. Mrs. Chen from 4B dragging her shopping cart toward the bus stop. 2 men in stained work uniforms heading to the construction site on Alameda. A group of teenage boys in red bandanas who everyone knew better than to look at directly. Nobody even glanced at the boy behind the fence. That was the rule. Mind your business. Don't see nothing, don't know nothing, don't do nothing. Every kid in the projects learned that before they learned to read. Michelle's fingers tightened on her lunch bag. The boy's chest rose and fell, barely. He was still breathing, but it looked like he was running out of the will to continue. Flies had started to gather on him. Actual flies, like he was already carrion. She walked to the fence. Up close, he looked even worse. His hair was matted with dirt and something that might have been blood. His hands were scraped raw, fingernails broken. But it was his eyes that stopped her. When she crouched down, those eyes opened and fixed on her face, and they weren't dull anymore. They were desperate and dark and so full of animal fear that Michelle forgot to be scared herself. "Hey," she whispered. He didn't respond, didn't even seem to understand. Michelle unfolded the top of her lunch bag and pulled out one piece of chicken. The foil crinkled loud in the morning air. The boy's eyes tracked the movement like a starving dog watching a steak. She should walk away. Grandma Ruth had been clear. Don't talk to strangers, baby, it ain't safe. Especially not strange boys who show up out of nowhere and don't talk and might be crazy or sick or dangerous. The projects were full of people who'd made the mistake of being kind to the wrong stranger. That's how you got robbed, how you got hurt, how you got disappeared. But the boy made a sound, not a word, just a broken exhale that sounded like pleas without language. Michelle pushed the chicken through the gap in the chain-link fence. The boy stared at it like he'd forgotten what food was. His hand trembled as it reached out, fingers so thin they looked like bird bones. He took the chicken and just held it for a moment, as if checking whether it was real, whether it would vanish if he looked away. Then he ate, not like a person, like something that had been starving for weeks. He didn't chew so much as swallow, his throat working frantically, tears streaming down his dirty face. When the chicken was gone, he looked at Michelle with an expression that made her feel like she'd done something important, something bigger than just sharing lunch. She pushed the apple through next, then the crackers. The boy ate everything, and when it was gone, he pressed his forehead against the fence and closed his eyes. His lips moved, forming words in a language Michelle didn't understand. It sounded like thank you. It sounded like prayer. Michelle was late to school. Mr. Patterson gave her detention. She didn't care. That afternoon, she took the long way home past the fence. The boy was still there, sitting up now, stronger. When he saw her, his face transformed. She'd never seen anyone look at her like that before, like she was something holy, something worth believing in. The next morning, Michelle scraped half her breakfast into a plastic container before Grandma Ruth came into the kitchen. Scrambled eggs, still warm, a piece of toast with butter. She wrapped it in foil and hid it in her backpack. At the fence, the boy was waiting. He'd moved closer to the gap, as if he'd been counting the hours until she came back. Michelle pushed the food through without saying anything. The boy took it with both hands, nodded once, and ate slower this time, like he was trying to make it last. "What's your name?" Michelle asked. The boy looked up at her. His mouth opened, then closed. He seemed to be searching for English words and coming up empty. Finally, he tapped his chest. "Suck," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, the syllable thick with an accent Michelle couldn't place. "Sook." He nodded vigorously. "Suck. I'm Michelle." "Michelle." He tried the name out carefully, like he was afraid of breaking it. She smiled. He smiled back, and for a moment he didn't look like a dying boy anymore. He just looked like a kid. Maybe her age, maybe a little older. It was hard to tell with the hunger carved into his face. "Why you out here?" Michelle asked. "Where's your mama?" The smile disappeared. Suck shook his head slowly, and something in his eyes went dark. He said something in his language, but Michelle didn't need a translation. She knew that look. She'd seen it in the mirror after her daddy got shot 3 years ago. "No mama, or maybe no mama anymore." "You got somewhere to go." Another head shake. "Someone gonna come get you." Suck just stared at her with those old eyes that had seen things no kid should see. Michelle sat down on her side of the fence. She was definitely going to be late again. Detention was going to turn into suspension if she kept this up. But the boy, Suck, he looked at her like she was the only good thing left in the world, and Michelle couldn't make herself walk away. "You gonna be okay?" she asked, knowing it was a stupid question. Suck reached through the fence. His hand was still shaking, but he managed to touch Michelle's fingers where they gripped the chain link. His skin was fever hot. "Angel," he said in English. The word was clumsy but clear. "You angel." "I ain't no angel," Michelle said, pulling her hand back, suddenly embarrassed. "I just got extra food sometimes." But Suck kept looking at her like she'd saved his life. And maybe she had. Or maybe she was just delaying the inevitable. The projects had a way of killing people slow, and a boy alone with no family and no money and no language didn't stand a chance. Still, Michelle came back the next morning, and the morning after that. She learned to lie to Grandma Ruth about being hungry, about eating big lunches at school. She learned to scrape her plate before Grandma could see how much was left. She learned to time her walks so she could pass the fence when nobody else was watching, so the other kids wouldn't see her feeding the ghost boy and start asking questions she couldn't answer. Suck got stronger, not healthy but stronger. He started standing when she approached, started waiting by the gap in the fence like a dog who'd learned the sound of its owner's footsteps. He tried to teach her words in his language, thank you, friend, hungry, and she tried to teach him more English. He was smart. He picked up words fast, hoarding them like they were as valuable as the food she brought. By the end of the first week, he could say, "Thank you, Michelle," without stumbling. By the end of the second week, he could say, "I wait for you." By the end of the third week, he could say, "You good person, best person." And Michelle, despite Grandma Ruth's warnings about strangers and danger and minding your own business, started to think of Suck as something like a friend. A secret friend. The one good thing she did that nobody knew about. She didn't tell anyone, not her little brother, not her best friend Shanice. Definitely not Grandma Ruth. This was hers. This small act of defiance against the rule that said you didn't help, didn't see, didn't care. In the projects, kindness was weakness. Caring got you hurt. But every morning when Suck looked at her like she was an angel, Michelle felt like maybe the rules were wrong. Maybe there was still room in this hard place for something soft, something good. She didn't know yet that kindness could be a seed, that what you planted in the dark could grow into something terrible and beautiful, that saving a dying boy could change the trajectory of her entire life. She just knew that when Suck smiled at her through the chain-link fence, she felt like she mattered. Like she was more than just another poor black girl trying to survive in a neighborhood that ate its young. She was someone who'd made a choice, who'd seen suffering and decided it wasn't acceptable, who'd said no to the silence. That had to count for something, even if it cost her everything. The black SUVs arrived on a Tuesday morning when the air was so thick with humidity it felt like breathing through wet cotton. Michelle was running late again. Grandma Ruth had asked her to braid her little brother's hair before school, and Terrence had squirmed and complained the whole time. So she was speed walking down Riverside Avenue with her backpack bouncing against her spine and half a biscuit, wrapped in foil, burning a hole in her pocket. She saw the vehicles before she heard them. That's how quiet they were, rolling down a street where every car announced itself with rattling mufflers and bass-heavy stereos. These SUVs moved like shadows, black paint so pristine it looked like they'd driven straight out of a car commercial. Cadillac Escalades with windows tinted so dark they might as well have been painted over. Chrome rims that caught the morning sun and threw it back in sharp, expensive flashes. They didn't belong here. Nothing that clean, that new, that expensive belonged in the Riverside projects unless it was carrying cops or feds, and even those came in marked vehicles with lights on top. These looked like the kind of trucks that rolled up to fancy hotels downtown, the kind Michelle had only seen on TV. She slowed her pace without meaning to. Her survival instincts, honed by 9 years of reading the streets, told her something was wrong. The SUVs pulled to the curb directly in front of the playground fence, engines purring like predatory animals. No music, no voices, just that expensive mechanical hum that separated the haves from the have-nots. Michelle's stomach dropped. The fence. They'd stopped at the fence where Suck stayed. 4 doors opened simultaneously with the choreographed precision of a military operation. The men who emerged looked like they'd stepped out of a different dimension. Dark suits, perfectly tailored, the kind that probably cost more than Grandma Ruth made in 6 months. Sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Dress shoes so shiny they reflected the cracked pavement. 3 of them were Asian. Korean, Michelle thought, remembering the few words Suck had taught her, and they moved with the economical grace of people who knew exactly what they were doing and didn't expect resistance. The 4th man was older, gray at the temples, with a scar that ran from his ear to his jaw. He stood by the lead vehicle and lit a cigarette with a gold lighter, watching the others like a general surveying troops. Michelle's feet had stopped moving entirely. She stood 30 feet away, frozen, clutching her backpack straps so hard her knuckles ached. Behind the fence, Suck had seen them too. He'd scrambled to his feet, backing away from the chain link like it had suddenly become electrified. His face had gone sheet white, all the color draining out so fast it looked like he might pass out. His mouth opened, but no sound came out, just raw, animal terror in his eyes. The men didn't bother with the gate. 2 of them simply gripped the chain link and pulled, and the old, rusted fence gave way with a screech of tortured metal that made Michelle flinch. They stepped through the gap like they were entering a room they owned, their movements unhurried, businesslike. No! The word came out of Michelle's mouth before she could stop it. Barely a whisper, but Suck's eyes snapped to her face across the distance. Recognition flashed there, followed by something that looked like desperation and shame and apology all mixed together. One of the suited men reached Suck and said something in Korean. Sharp, clipped syllables that sounded like orders. Suck shook his head violently, backing up until his shoulders hit the fence on the far side. He responded in the same language, his voice high and cracking with panic. The man's expression didn't change. He reached out and grabbed Suck's arm. That's when Suck fought. He was small and starved and weak. But he fought like something wild. He twisted in the man's grip, his feet scrabbling for purchase on the dirt. When the man tried to wrap both arms around him, Suck's head snapped forward and his teeth sank into the hand gripping his shoulder. The man grunted, the first real sound Michelle had heard from any of them, and jerked back. Blood welled up between his fingers where Suck's teeth had broken skin. For a moment, the man just stared at his hand like he couldn't quite believe a half-dead street kid had managed to hurt him. Then his other hand moved so fast Michelle barely saw it. The slap echoed across the playground, sharp as a gunshot. Suck's head whipped to the side and he crumpled, held upright only by the grip on his arm. Stop! Michelle was running before she knew she'd decided to move. Her backpack flew off her shoulders as she sprinted toward the fence, the biscuit falling from her pocket and rolling across the concrete. Stop! You're hurting him! Leave him alone. The scarred man by the SUV spoke a single word in Korean. Every head turned toward Michelle. The men's expressions were hidden behind their sunglasses, but their body language radiated warning. The one holding Suck adjusted his grip, lifting the boy clear off the ground like he weighed nothing. Michelle hit the fence with both hands, the chain link rattling under her impact. "Put him down! He didn't do nothing. He's just a kid." For a moment, the scene froze. Michelle pressed against the fence, breathing hard, her voice echoing off the project buildings. The men in suits stood in the abandoned lot holding a limp, terrified boy. The scarred man took a long drag from his cigarette and studied Michelle with the kind of cold assessment that made her skin crawl. Then he nodded once, sharply. The men began moving again, carrying Suck toward the vehicles. "No," Suck's voice cracked into English, fighting against the hands restraining him. Michelle, no." He thrashed, found his feet, and dug his heels into the dirt. The second man grabbed his other arm, and between the two of them, they dragged him through the gap in the fence. Suck twisted his head back, his eyes locked on Michelle's face with an intensity that made her heart stop. "I remember you." The words came out in a desperate scream, half sobbing, his accent thick but the meaning crystal clear. "I remember I come back, I." One of the men said something sharp. Suck ignored him, still fighting, still staring at Michelle like she was the only thing anchoring him to the world. "I come back, I buy everything, I buy." They threw him into the back of the second SUV with brutal efficiency. Suck's face appeared in the window for a moment, pressed against the dark glass, his mouth still forming words Michelle couldn't hear. His palms slapped against the window, leaving smudged handprints. Then the door slammed shut, and the tinting swallowed him whole. Michelle ran along the fence line, her throat raw from screaming. "Wait, were you taking him? Wait." The scarred man dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his heel. He looked at Michelle for a long moment, his expression unreadable behind the sunglasses. Then he climbed into the passenger seat of the lead vehicle, and all 4 SUVs pulled away from the curb in perfect synchronization. They disappeared down Riverside Avenue, turned left on Alameda, and were gone. Michelle stood at the fence, her hands still gripping the chain link, her chest heaving. The whole thing had taken maybe 3 minutes. 3 minutes and Suck was just gone, vanished into those black trucks like he'd never existed at all. She became aware of the silence. That particular heavy silence of the projects where something bad had happened and everyone had seen it, but nobody was going to talk about it. Michelle turned slowly, her eyes scanning the street. Mrs. Chen was still at the bus stop, clutching her shopping cart, her face carefully blank. The 2 construction workers had stopped walking but were already turning away, their backs rigid with the determination to not see. The teenage boys in red bandanas had melted into the shadows between buildings, gone like smoke. Further down the block, Michelle could see curtains dropping back into place, faces disappearing from windows, a woman hurrying her child inside, hand on the kid's head, pushing them through a doorway. Everyone had seen. Everyone had watched a child get dragged into vehicles and driven away. And everyone was doing what they always did in the projects. Nothing. Because snitches get stitches. Because you don't call the cops in Riverside unless you want to end up as the next problem. Because getting involved meant painting a target on your back, and everybody had enough problems without borrowing someone else's. Michelle felt something hot and sharp rise in her throat. "Somebody call the police." Her voice cracked on the words. "They took him. Y'all saw them take him." Mrs. Chen's grip tightened on her shopping cart. She stared straight ahead at the bus stop sign like it was the most fascinating thing she'd ever seen. "Please," Michelle spun toward the construction workers. "He's just a kid. They just kidnapped him." One of the workers glanced at her, and Michelle saw something like pity in his eyes before he looked away. "Ain't see nothing, little sister," he muttered. "And neither did you go to school." They kept walking. Michelle ran into the street, her vision blurring with tears. Somebody do something. Why ain't nobody doing nothing? But the street was already emptying. People were finding reasons to be elsewhere, to turn corners, to remember urgent business that required their immediate attention. The projects had swallowed the moment whole and was already digesting it, erasing it from the collective memory, because remembering was dangerous. A hand grabbed Michelle's shoulder and she yelped, spinning around. It was Big Tommy from 7C, one of the older boys who sometimes dealt on the corner. His face was hard but not unkind. "Get inside, little girl. Whatever you think you saw, you didn't see it. That's how you stay alive around here." "But they took." "I know what they took." His voice was quiet, urgent. "And I know what happens to people who ask too many questions about things that ain't their business. Those weren't cops, Michelle. Those were real problems. The kind that come back. The kind that remember faces. You understand me." Michelle stared at him, at his serious eyes, at the way his hand on her shoulder was almost protective, like he was trying to save her from her own impulse to do the right thing. "That's fucked up," she whispered. "Yeah," Big Tommy agreed. "It is. World's fucked up. Now go to school before you miss the whole day." He walked away, hands in his pockets, just another project kid trying to survive long enough to become a project adult. Michelle stood alone in the middle of Riverside Avenue. The street looked the same as it always did: cracked pavement, graffiti-tagged walls, broken streetlights waiting for maintenance that would never come. Like nothing had happened at all. Like a boy hadn't just been torn away from the only place he'd known for months, from the only person who'd shown him kindness. She walked back to the fence slowly. The gap the men had torn was still there, the chain link peeled back like a wound. In the dirt beyond, she could see the depression where Suck had been sitting, the spot where he'd eaten the meals she'd brought him, the place he'd waited for her every morning like she was the only good thing in his world. Michelle crouched down and picked up the biscuit she'd dropped. The foil had come unwrapped, and the biscuit itself had rolled through dirt and debris, ruined. She held it in her palm and cried silently, her tears falling onto the cracked concrete. The whole neighborhood had turned a blind eye while a child was taken because they were afraid of the system, afraid of retaliation, afraid of becoming the next target. And Michelle understood that fear. She'd lived with it her whole life, but understanding didn't make it right. It just made it worse. She stayed there until the school bell rang in the distance, faint and mocking. Then she stood up, brushed off her uniform, and walked toward her classes like a ghost herself. The plane landed at Incheon International Airport 17 hours after the SUVs had pulled away from the Riverside projects. Suck had cried for the first 6 hours until the scarred man, Director Choi, the others called him, told him in cold, precise English that if he didn't shut his mouth, they would tape it shut. After that, Suck had gone silent, pressing his forehead against the window and watching America disappear beneath the clouds. He'd never been on a plane before, never left the projects. The furthest he'd traveled in his short life was the 3 miles from the shelter where his mother had died to the abandoned lot where he'd collapsed. Too weak and too heartbroken to keep searching for help that wouldn't come. Now he was being dragged across the ocean to a country he barely remembered, and all he could think about was the girl with the cornrows and the backpack who'd looked at him like he mattered. Michelle. The only person in America who'd seen him dying and decided that wasn't acceptable. He tried to memorize her face during those 3 months, the way her nose crinkled when she smiled, the gap between her front teeth, the exact pattern of beads in her braids. He was terrified he'd forget, that Seoul would swallow the memory whole, so he'd repeated her name like a prayer during the flight. Michelle. Michelle. Michelle James from the Riverside projects who'd saved his life with leftovers and kindness. Korea hit him like a fist to the chest. The humidity was similar to summer in the projects, but everything else was alien. The signs were in Hangul characters he could barely read. The voices around him spoke Korean so fast and fluid it sounded nothing like the broken phrases his mother had taught him. Even the air smelled different, metal and ocean and millions of people compressed into a space that felt both vast and suffocating. They drove him to a compound in Gangnam, through streets that made the Riverside projects look like a ghost town. Seoul was alive in a way that made his eyes hurt. Neon signs and glass towers and endless streams of people who all seemed to know exactly where they were going. The SUVs pulled through gates that opened automatically, into a courtyard surrounded by walls topped with cameras and security lights. The man waiting for them stood in a tailored suit that probably cost more than every building in the Riverside projects combined. He was in his 50s, iron-gray hair slicked back, face carved from granite. When he saw Suck being pulled from the SUV, his expression twisted into something between disgust and obligation. Director Choi spoke rapidly in Korean. The older man's eyes never left Suk's face. When Choi finished, the older man, Suk, would learn he was Chairman Dokgo, head of the Jumdo syndicate, said something that made every man in the courtyard go rigid with tension. Then he switched to English, his accent thick but his words deliberate. You are Dokgo T-Suk. Your whore mother ran to America and died like a dog, leaving you to embarrass this family with your mixed blood and your gutter smell. You should have died in that American slum. But you are here now, and blood is blood, even when it is polluted. Suk didn't understand all the words, but he understood the tone. He'd heard it before from the kids in the projects who called him names, from the shelter workers who looked at him like he was garbage. Disgust. Contempt. The specific kind of hatred reserved for people who didn't fit into neat categories. You will learn to be useful, Chairman Dokgo continued. Or you will die. Those are your choices. Do you understand? Suk's throat was too tight to speak. He nodded once. Good. Take him to the basement. Let the others teach him his place. The basement was where the Jumdo syndicate kept its lowest-ranking soldiers, the debt collectors, the leg breakers, the disposable muscle that did the dirty work the higher ranks wouldn't soil their hands with. It was a concrete warren of rooms that smelled like sweat and cigarettes and violence. 20 men lived down there, sleeping on mats, eating from shared pots of rice and kimchi, spending their days terrorizing shopkeepers and deadbeats who owed the syndicate money. They took one look at Suk and decided he was prey. The beatings started that first night. Nothing that would kill him. Chairman Dokgo had made it clear the boy was family, however polluted, but enough to make him understand that mixed-blood bastards from America ranked somewhere below the rats in the walls. They called him Twiggy, mongrel, and worse things in Korean slang Suk had to learn through repetition and pain. They made him clean their dishes, scrub their floors, run their errands. When he moved too slowly or spoke with his American accent, they used fists and feet to correct him. Suk learned fast that crying made it worse, that showing fear invited more violence, that the only language these men respected was strength, and he had none. So he learned to take it, learned to curl into a ball to protect his vital organs, learned to bite down on his tongue so they wouldn't hear him scream, learned to hate with a purity that burned hotter than any pain they could inflict. And at night, when the others were asleep or out collecting debts, Suk would pull out the rusted subway token Michelle had pressed into his palm before the SUVs took him away. He'd found it in his pocket on the plane, miraculous and impossible, a piece of her kindness that had survived the abduction. The token was bent and corroded, the Metropolitan Transit Authority logo barely visible, but to Suk it was more valuable than anything in the compound. He would hold it in his palm and remember, her face, her voice saying his name, the way she'd looked at him like he was human, like he deserved to live, like his life had value. It was the only thing that kept him from giving up, from walking into traffic or swallowing poison or any of the 100 ways a boy could disappear in Seoul without anyone caring. Michelle had saved him once. He owed it to her to survive. 6 months in the basement, 6 months of beatings and degradation and learning to hate, but also 6 months of watching. Suk paid attention to how the syndicate worked, how Director Choi issued orders and expected immediate obedience, how the debt collectors operated in pairs, using intimidation before violence, how money flowed up the chain of command while risk flowed down, how the men who survived longest were the ones who were ruthless but not reckless, brutal but not wasteful. He learned Korean properly, losing his American accent through desperate immersion. He learned to bow at the right angle to the right people. He learned which fights to pick and which to avoid. Most importantly, he learned that the syndicate respected results more than bloodline. If you brought in money, collected debts others couldn't collect, solved problems others couldn't solve, you moved up. The hatred didn't disappear, but it became secondary to utility. On his 10th birthday, not that anyone knew or cared, Suk was sent on his first real collection job. A restaurant owner in Itaewon owed 3 million won and had been dodging the syndicate's calls. Suk's partner was a man named Kang, a veteran collector with scarred knuckles and dead eyes who'd made it clear he thought bringing a 13-year-old mongrel on collections was an insult to his professionalism. The restaurant owner was a small man with scared eyes who kept saying he needed more time. His wife was sick. Business was slow. Kang listened to the excuses with the patience of a snake watching a mouse, then nodded to Suk. "Show me you're worth the rice you eat, Twiggy." Suk looked at the restaurant owner, at his trembling hands, at the family photos on the wall behind the register. He thought about Michelle, about how she'd given him food when she barely had enough for herself, about how kindness worked in the projects. Then he picked up a chair and smashed it through the restaurant's front window. The owner gasped, stumbling backward. Suk walked through the broken glass, his shoes crunching on the shards, and grabbed the man by his collar. The violence came easily, too easily, like it had been waiting inside him all along, just needing permission to emerge. "Pay," Suk said in Korean, his voice flat, "or I burn this place down with your family inside." He meant it. In that moment, with rage and survival instinct coursing through his veins, he absolutely meant it. The restaurant owner saw that truth in his eyes and broke. He produced the money from a safe behind the counter, hands shaking so badly he could barely work the combination. Kang watched the whole thing with something like approval in his dead eyes. On the walk back to the compound, he clapped Suk on the shoulder, the first time anyone in the syndicate had touched him without malice. "Maybe you're not completely useless after all, Mutt." It wasn't a compliment, but it was acknowledgement, and in the basement hierarchy, that was worth more than gold. Suk moved up, slowly at first, then faster as his reputation grew. The mixed-blood kid who didn't flinch, who collected debts others couldn't collect, who would burn your business, break your legs, disappear your family without hesitation or remorse. The violence fed something dark inside him, filled the hollow place where his mother's love used to live. But he never forgot why he was doing it. Every time he collected money, he set aside a portion. Not stealing, he wasn't stupid enough to steal from the syndicate, but negotiating bonuses, taking percentages, building a small fortune transaction by transaction. And every night, he held Michelle's subway token and promised himself that someday, somehow, he would have enough power and money to go back. To find her, to repay her, to prove that the dying boy she'd saved had become somebody worth saving. At 16, he killed his first man, a rival syndicate soldier who tried to ambush him during a collection. Suk had seen the attack coming, survival instincts honed by years of basement beatings, and countered with a broken bottle. The man bled out on the pavement while Suk watched, feeling nothing but a cold satisfaction that he was still breathing and his enemy wasn't. Chairman Dokgo called him to his office that night. Suk stood before the old man's desk, blood still under his fingernails, wondering if this was where they decided he'd become too dangerous to keep alive. Instead, Chairman Dokgo studied him with calculating eyes and said, "You have your father's instinct for survival, and your mother's mongrel tenacity. Perhaps you are not worthless after all." It was the closest thing to approval Suk had ever received from the man. He bowed deeply, maintaining the subservient posture even as hatred churned in his gut. Chairman Dokgo was his grandfather, but Suk felt nothing but contempt for the man who'd let his mother run away to America, who'd let her die alone in a foreign country, who'd only retrieved Suk out of obligation rather than love. But he played the game, bowed and scraped and said yes, chairman, while building his power base one debt at a time. At 19, Suk was moved out of the basement into actual quarters. At 21, he was leading collection teams. At 23, he was Director Choi's unofficial enforcer, the man you sent when negotiations had failed and only violence would solve the problem. And through it all, he kept the subway token. He taped it to the grip of his first pistol, a Daewoo K5 he'd taken off a dead cop during a raid gone wrong. Every time he drew the weapon, his thumb would press against the outline of that bent token, and he would remember. Michelle James, Riverside Projects, the girl who'd fed a dying boy and expected nothing in return. The promise he'd screamed at her as the SUVs drove away, "I come back, I buy everything." Seoul had tried to beat that promise out of him. The syndicate had tried to bury it under violence and blood. But Suk kept it alive the way Michelle had kept him alive, through sheer stubborn refusal to let it die. When Chairman Dokgo collapsed from a stroke at 68, Director Choi made his move to take control of the Jumdo syndicate. He had support from the old guard, the veterans who'd served under Dokgo for decades. But he'd underestimated how much loyalty Suk had built among the younger soldiers, the ones who'd come up through the basement, and understood that power belonged to whoever was strong enough to take it. The civil war within the syndicate lasted 3 weeks. By the end, Director Choi was dead, along with most of his supporters. The survivors bent the knee to Dokgo Suk, the mixed-blood mongrel from America who'd clawed his way from the bottom of the basement to the head of the table. Suk stood in Chairman Dokgo's old office, looking out at the Seoul skyline, holding the pistol with Michelle's token taped to its grip. He was 28 years old. He controlled a criminal empire worth hundreds of millions. He had an army of soldiers who would kill or die on his word. He had everything a boy from the Riverside projects could never have imagined. And all of it, every dollar, every drop of blood, every broken bone and burned building, had been in service of a single promise made by a starving child to a girl who'd shown him kindness. It was time to go back. Time to find Michelle James and prove that the boy behind the fence had kept his word, even if keeping it had cost him his humanity. 20 years had a way of grinding people down in the Riverside projects. Michelle James had watched it happen to everyone she knew, watched them get smaller, quieter, more defeated with each passing year, until they were just going through the motions of living without actually being alive. Some got out through college or the military or sheer luck. Most didn't. Most just learned to survive in a place designed to break them. Michelle had become a nurse. It seemed like the only way to fight back against everything the projects represented. Every overdose she reversed, every gunshot wound she stabilized, every child she saved from preventable illness felt like a small victory against the machine that wanted her community dead or imprisoned or forgotten. The work was brutal, and the pay was insulting, and she went home most nights so exhausted she'd fall asleep in her scrubs without eating dinner. But it mattered. It had to matter. City General Hospital sat on the border between Riverside and the marginally less terrible neighborhood of Westlake. It was an old building, perpetually underfunded, where the emergency room stayed packed and the staff stayed understaffed, and nobody ever seemed to have the supplies they actually needed. The fluorescent lights flickered. The linoleum was cracked. The waiting room chairs had been donated by a church in the 90s and looked like it. But it was the only hospital that served the projects without asking too many questions, so it stayed full of knife wounds and overdoses and kids with asthma so bad they couldn't breathe. Michelle worked the night shift because it paid slightly more, and because Grandma Ruth, 73 now and fighting arthritis that made her hands curl like claws, needed someone home during the day to help with grocery shopping and doctor's appointments. Terrence, her little brother, had made it out. Full ride to Howard University, studying engineering, sending money home when he could. Michelle was proud of him, proud and envious in equal measure, though she'd never say that out loud. She'd been on her feet for 9 hours when Big T walked into the emergency room like he owned it. He probably thought he did. Big T, real name Terrell Thompson, ran the drug trade in Riverside with the kind of casual brutality that kept everyone in line. He wasn't the scariest dealer Michelle had ever met, but he was the most persistent. He had money and muscle and no conscience, which in the projects made you royalty. He was flanked by 2 of his crew, young men in their early 20s wearing red like it was a uniform. One of them had a gash across his forearm that was obviously knife-related. The other looked high, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Big T himself was 35 and built like someone who'd played football in high school and then discovered weight training and steroids. His jewelry caught the fluorescent light and threw it back in sharp flashes. Gold chains, diamond studs, a watch that probably cost more than Michelle's car. Michelle was at the nurse's station updating charts when she felt his presence like a pressure change. She didn't look up immediately. That was another survival skill from the projects. Never let them see you're paying attention until you absolutely have to. She finished writing her note about Mrs. Patterson in bed 7, set down her pen with deliberate care, and only then raised her eyes. Big T was leaning against the counter with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never been told no and meant it. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. Michelle James, look at you, still saving lives and making minimum wage. Can I help you, Terrell? She kept her voice professional, clinical. Used his real name because it reminded both of them that she'd known him since he was 12, before he'd decided that selling death was easier than working for a living. The smile thinned. He didn't like being reminded of the boy he used to be. My boy Darnell here needs stitches. Cut himself working. You gonna take care of him or you gonna make us wait with all these other broke motherfuckers? Michelle glanced at Darnell's arm. The wound was deep but not immediately life-threatening. Sign in at the desk. We'll call you when it's your turn. There are people ahead of you. Nah, Big T's voice hardened. We ain't waiting. You gonna take care of him now. We have a 70-year-old having a heart attack in Trauma 1 and a 6-year-old with a compound fracture in Trauma 2. Your friend's cut can wait 20 minutes. The high one giggled at that, like the idea of waiting was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Big T's jaw tightened. He leaned closer, close enough that Michelle could smell his cologne, something expensive trying to cover the underlying scent of weed and violence. You know what your problem is, Michelle. You still think the rules apply. Like this hospital gives a fuck about you or anybody else from the projects. Like working yourself to death for these people is gonna change anything. He paused. Let that sink in. But I'm not here to argue about your boy. I'm here to talk business. Michelle's stomach clenched. She'd known this was coming. Big T had been circling closer for months, testing boundaries, seeing how much pressure it would take to crack her. I don't have business with you. Yeah, you do. See, my operation's been having supply issues. And you got access to all kinds of useful medications. Oxy, Percocet, Xanax, that good pharmaceutical shit people pay top dollar for. I'm thinking we could have a mutually beneficial arrangement. I'm not stealing drugs for you. You say stealing. I say redistributing resources to people who need them. You know how many people in Riverside are hurting? How many need something to take the edge off their shitty lives? You'd be helping the community. It was such obvious manipulation that Michelle almost laughed. Almost. But laughing at Big T was a good way to end up with a knife between your ribs in an alley. The answer's no. Find another way to poison the neighborhood. The smile disappeared entirely. Big T straightened up, and suddenly the two men flanking him seemed a lot bigger, a lot closer. The emergency room continued its controlled chaos around them. Phones ringing, monitors beeping, someone crying in one of the exam rooms. But Michelle felt like she was trapped in a bubble of tension that could pop at any moment. You think you special? Big T's voice dropped to something quiet and dangerous. You think that nursing degree makes you better than everybody else trying to survive out here. Let me tell you something, Michelle. I remember when you was that little girl feeding that ghost boy through the fence. Wasting food on some random kid when your own family was going hungry. You always been stupid like that, always thinking you can save people who don't want to be saved. The mention of suck hit her like a physical blow. Michelle hadn't thought about that boy in years. Or that was a lie. She thought about him sometimes, late at night when she couldn't sleep, wondering what had happened to him. Whether he'd survived whatever those men in the black SUVs had planned. Whether he'd remembered the girl who'd fed him cornbread and leftovers. Whether he was even still alive. She pushed the memory down hard. I said no. Now either sign in for treatment or leave. I have actual patients to attend to. Big T studied her for a long moment. His expression was calculating, weighing options, deciding how much resistance was acceptable before he had to make an example. Michelle kept her face neutral, her posture professional, but inside she was screaming. She knew what happened to people who told Big T no. Everybody in Riverside knew. There was Latasha from 5B who'd refused to let him run product through her apartment and ended up with her windows shot out. There was Jerome who'd tried to start his own corner operation and disappeared for 3 days, came back with burn marks and missing teeth. But Michelle also knew that if she gave in now, if she became Big T's pharmacy, she'd be complicit in every overdose, every addiction, every life destroyed by the drugs she provided. She'd be killing her community as surely as any bullet, and she hadn't spent 10 years becoming a nurse just to participate in its destruction. You got until Friday, Big T said finally. Friday night, you gonna bring me a package. Oxy, Percocet, whatever you can get. And we gonna establish a regular schedule after that. You do this, we all make money and stay friendly. You don't. He shrugged. Well, you a smart girl. You can imagine what happens to people who waste my time. He pushed away from the counter, nodded to his crew. Darnell cradled his bleeding arm and followed. The High One was still giggling quietly to himself, lost in whatever pharmaceutical fog he was swimming through. Big T paused at the emergency room entrance, looked back at Michelle with eyes that held no humanity whatsoever. Friday, he repeated. Then he was gone, pushing through the automatic doors into the night. Michelle's hands were shaking. She gripped the edge of the counter until her knuckles went white, focusing on breathing steadily, refusing to let anyone see how terrified she actually was. Around her, the emergency room continued its familiar chaos. Nobody had noticed the interaction, or if they had, they were doing what everyone in the projects always did, minding their business, staying out of drama that could get them killed. Dr. Singh emerged from Trauma 1, pulling off bloody gloves. Michelle, I need you in too. The kid with the fracture needs conscious sedation before we can set it. On my way. Her voice came out steady, professional, like she hadn't just been threatened by a drug lord who could make her disappear any time he wanted. She washed her hands in the sink, scrubbing methodically, and caught her reflection in the mirror above the basin. 29 years old, and she looked older, exhausted. The braids she'd worn as a kid were long gone, replaced by hair pulled back in a practical bun. She had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's cheekbones, and too many sleepless nights written across her face. This wasn't how she'd imagined her life turning out. When she was 9 years old feeding a dying boy through a fence, she thought maybe kindness mattered. Maybe being good was enough. 20 years later, she knew better. Kindness got you threatened. Being good got you targeted. The projects didn't reward virtue, they punished it. But Michelle walked into Trauma 2 anyway, smiled at the crying 6-year-old with the broken arm, and prepared the sedation like she did every night. Because what else could she do? Stop being a nurse. Give Big T what he wanted and become part of the problem. Run away like Terrence had and leave Grandma Ruth alone. No, she'd made her choice the day she'd pushed that cornbread through the fence. She decided then that she was going to be someone who helped, even when helping cost her everything. Even when the world punished her for it. Even when it might get her killed. She had until Friday to figure out how to survive saying no to Big T 4 days, to find a way out of an impossible situation. 4 days to prove that the 9-year-old girl who'd saved a dying boy hadn't been naive. She'd been right. Michelle just hoped she lived long enough to see it. The Jumdo Syndicate's American operations had existed in the shadows for decades. Money laundering through Korean businesses in LA and New York. Protection rackets in Koreatown, strategic investments that looked legitimate on paper, but financed everything from human trafficking to pharmaceutical smuggling. Doc Go-suk had studied those operations for years, understanding that real power wasn't just about violence. It was about knowing where money lived and how to move it without attracting attention from agencies with 3-letter names and federal budgets. When his private jet landed at Lax on a Tuesday morning, Suk had already been working on the Riverside Project's acquisition for 6 months. The housing complex was owned by a shell corporation that was owned by another shell corporation that eventually traced back to a hedge fund in Delaware. The hedge fund had been bleeding the projects dry for 20 years, collecting rent, doing minimal maintenance, waiting for the land value to appreciate enough to justify bulldozing the whole thing and building condos. Suk bought the hedge fund, all of it, paid 40% over market value and closed the deal in 3 weeks. The hedge fund managers probably thought they'd found the world's dumbest investor, some foreign money looking to diversify. They had no idea they just sold him the key to finding Michelle James. He'd tried finding her other ways first. Credit reports, social media, employment records. But Michelle had stayed in Riverside, and people in Riverside didn't leave digital footprints if they could help it. No Facebook, no Instagram. Her nursing license was registered to an address that turned out to be her grandmother's apartment in Building 7. By the time Suk's people confirmed she still lived in the projects, he was already planning his return. 20 years. 20 years since black SUVs had dragged him away while he screamed promises he'd had no ability to keep. 20 years of surviving Seoul's underworld, of becoming the kind of monster who could walk into a room and make men with guns nervous. 20 years of keeping a rusted subway token taped to his pistol and remembering a girl who'd shared her food with a dying stranger. He'd promised to come back and buy everything, time to make good. The convoy that rolled into Riverside at dawn consisted of 8 vehicles, 6 SUVs and 2 armored sedans, all black, all moving with the coordinated precision of a military operation. They didn't announce themselves with sirens or lights. They simply appeared, flowing through the early morning streets like oil, and took up positions at every corner of the housing complex. The men who emerged were nothing like the gang members who usually controlled these blocks. They wore suits, not expensive designer suits that would attract too much attention, but good quality, professional, the kind that said legitimate business, even if the business wasn't. They were Korean and Korean American, ranging from their 20s to their 40s, all of them moving with the economical grace of people who'd been trained to hurt others efficiently. No visible weapons, but everyone in the projects knew how to recognize armed men even when the guns were concealed. They didn't interact with the residents, didn't threaten anyone, didn't demand cooperation or respect. They simply stood on the corners with their hands folded, watching everything, saying nothing. When the local dealers showed up to work their usual spots, they found well-dressed Korean men occupying their territory. When they tried to argue, tried to assert their claim to those corners, the men in suits would smile politely and suggest they find somewhere else to conduct business. By noon, word had spread through Riverside like wildfire. Someone had bought the projects. Someone with serious money and serious muscle had moved into the neighborhood overnight and established control without firing a single shot. The usual sirens that provided the soundtrack to Project Life had gone silent. The drug traffic had evaporated. Even the street kids seemed confused, unsure how to act in a neighborhood that suddenly felt like it was under new management. Big T heard about it while he was eating breakfast in his girlfriend's apartment on the east side. One of his lieutenants called, voice tight with barely controlled panic, explaining that their corner operations had been shut down by men in suits who spoke Korean and didn't seem impressed by threats or territory claims, or the fact that Big T had been running Riverside for the past 8 years. "Who are they?" Big T demanded, already reaching for his gun. "Don't know, boss, but they're organized, military organized, and there's a lot of them. Counted at least 30 so far and more keep showing up." Big T drove to Riverside, his jaw tight, his mind racing. You didn't just walk into another man's territory and shut down his operation. That was a declaration of war. That was disrespect that had to be answered with violence, or else every other crew in the city would think Big T was weak. But when he rolled up to his usual corner and saw the men in suits standing there like human walls, something in his gut twisted. These weren't amateurs. These weren't even local competition. These were professionals, and professionals meant organization, which meant resources, which meant this situation was far more dangerous than some territorial dispute with another gang. One of the men smiled at Big T, actually smiled, polite and empty. "This corner is closed for business. We suggest you take your operations elsewhere." "The fuck you are," Big T said, his hand moving toward his waistband. "This is my block, has been for years, you don't just—" The smile never wavered. No disrespect intended, but you should leave now, while leaving is still an option. There was something in the man's eyes that made Big T hesitate. Not fear exactly. More like the calm certainty of someone who'd done worse things than shoot a local drug dealer and wouldn't lose sleep over doing it again. Big T looked past him at the other men positioned around the complex. Counted maybe 15 in visible range, which meant there were probably twice that many he couldn't see. He left, hated himself for it, but he left. You didn't fight a war you couldn't win. Not on the first day, anyway. First you gathered intelligence, figured out who these people were and what they wanted. Then you decided whether to negotiate or retaliate. But as he drove away, Big T felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Real fear the kind that came from recognizing you'd stumbled into something far beyond your weight class. Suk arrived at the projects that evening, stepping out of the lead sedan like a king surveying his kingdom. He wore a black suit that had been tailored in Seoul, Italian shoes that cost more than most Riverside residents made in a month, and no jewelry except for a watch that could have been used as a down payment on a house. His hair was cut short, professional. His face was handsome in a sharp, dangerous way. He looked like a CEO or a politician or maybe a high-end lawyer. Nothing about his appearance suggested he was the head of one of Seoul's most ruthless criminal syndicates. But the men in suits all bowed slightly as he passed, and that gesture alone told everyone watching exactly who he was. The boss. The man who'd bought their entire neighborhood overnight and moved an army into place while they slept. Suk walked through the complex slowly, his eyes taking in every detail. The graffiti-stained buildings, the cracked basketball court, the playground where he'd nearly died 20 years ago. The fence was still there, though someone had finally fixed the gap his kidnappers had torn open. Everything was smaller than he remembered, dingier, more compressed. But it was the same place. The concrete jungle where Michelle James had saved his life. He stopped at Building 7 and looked up at the third floor. His people had confirmed she still lived there with her grandmother. Apartment 7C right there, behind those windows with the security bars and the air conditioning unit that looked like it dated from the 90s. For a moment, Suk just stood there, feeling something in his chest that might have been nervousness if he'd still been capable of nervous. He'd built an empire. He'd killed men with his bare hands. He'd survived wars that left bodies stacked like cordwood. But the thought of knocking on that door, of seeing Michelle's face after 20 years, made him feel like that starving boy behind the fence again. He didn't knock. Not yet. First, he needed to see her. Needed to know she was real, that he hadn't spent 2 decades obsessing over a memory that had been distorted by trauma and desperation. His people had told him she worked night shift at City General, that she'd be heading to work around 7 p.m. So Suk waited, standing in the lengthening shadows, ignoring the curious and frightened stares of residents who were still trying to understand what was happening to their neighborhood. At 6:45, she emerged from Building 7. Suk's breath caught. 20 years had changed her. The little girl with braids and a backpack had become a woman, tall and tired-looking, wearing scrubs and carrying a purse that had seen better days. Her face had lost its childhood softness, replaced by the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from years of fighting battles you couldn't win. But it was her. The same eyes, the same determined set to her jaw, the same essential Michelle, Ness that had made a 9-year-old girl stop for a dying stranger when everyone else walked past. She didn't see him. She was focused on her phone, checking the time, walking quickly toward the bus stop on Riverside Avenue. Suk watched her disappear around the corner, and something in him that had been wound tight for 20 years finally began to uncoil. She was alive. She was here. She'd stayed in the projects, stayed in this grinding poverty, probably trying to save people the way she'd saved him. And Suk had the power now to change everything for her, to give her the life she deserved, to prove that the boy she'd fed hadn't forgotten, had never forgotten, would never forget. But first, he needed to see her somewhere neutral, somewhere she couldn't run from the conversation they needed to have. The hospital, he told his driver, now. City General Hospital at 8 p.m. was controlled chaos. The night shift was dealing with the usual influx of emergencies, car accidents, overdoses, violence-related injuries that no one would explain because explaining meant talking to cops. The security guard at the entrance was more decoration than actual security, an older man reading a paperback and occasionally glancing up when someone entered. He glanced up when Suk walked in, trailed by 2 of his men, opened his mouth to ask about visitor protocols, then saw something in their faces that made him close his mouth again and return to his book with a suddenness that suggested survival instincts kicking in. Suk walked through the emergency room like he owned it, past the waiting area full of people holding injuries and sick children, past the harried receptionist who called out, "Sir, you need to check in," before being distracted by a ringing phone, past examination rooms and medical equipment, and the institutional smell of antiseptic covering human suffering. He found Michelle at the nurse's station, bent over a computer, updating charts with the focused intensity of someone trying to lose herself in work. She tied her hair back in a practical bun. Her scrubs had a coffee stain on the sleeve. She looked exhausted and stressed and absolutely beautiful. Suk stopped 3 feet from the counter. One of his men moved to announce him, but Suk waved him off. This moment was his. He'd waited 20 years for it. He wasn't going to rush. "Michelle James," he said quietly. She looked up, and for a moment, her expression was just professional courtesy, a nurse acknowledging another visitor in a long night of visitors. Then her eyes actually focused on his face, really looked at him, and something clicked into place. Her face went pale. Her hand froze on the keyboard. Her mouth opened slightly, like she was trying to form words but couldn't quite find them. Suk smiled, not the empty professional smile he used for business. A real smile, the first one he'd managed in months. "Hello, Michelle, it's been a long time." She stared at him like she was seeing a ghost, which, in a way, she was. The ghost boy from the fence, all grown up and wearing an expensive suit, standing in her hospital like he'd stepped out of a memory she'd tried to forget. "Suk," her voice was barely a whisper. That's not, you can't be." "I promised I would come back," Suk said in English that had lost most of its Korean accent over years of practice. "I promised I would buy everything. I kept that promise, Michelle. I bought the whole complex, the whole block, all of it for you." Michelle just stared. Around them, the emergency room continued its familiar chaos, oblivious to the fact that 2 people were having a reunion 20 years in the making. Suk stepped closer to the counter, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough to see the exact moment recognition fully hit, and she understood that this wasn't a dream or a mistake. The boy she'd saved was standing in front of her, and he'd apparently become someone powerful enough to buy an entire housing complex. "I have one question," Suk said softly. "Before we talk about anything else, before I explain what I've done or why I'm here, just one question." Michelle's throat worked. "What question?" Suk reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a rusted subway token. Michelle's eyes widened as she recognized it. The token she'd given him before the SUVs took him away. The last connection to her father. The thing she'd pressed into his palm and told him to remember. He set it on the counter between them, that small piece of corroded metal that had traveled across the ocean and back, that had been taped to weapons and carried into battles, that had been his talisman through 20 years of violence and survival. "Are you still hungry?" Suk asked. And Michelle James, nurse and survivor and the girl who'd saved a dying boy with nothing but kindness, started to cry. Michelle couldn't breathe properly for 3 full minutes after Suk walked out of the hospital. She told him she needed to finish her shift, that they'd talk later, that she needed time to process the fact that the dying boy from 20 years ago had apparently become some kind of crime lord. He'd nodded like he understood, given her a business card with a phone number, and left with his suited entourage trailing behind him like shadows. Dr. Singh had asked if she was okay. She'd lied and said yes. Then she'd locked herself in the staff bathroom and cried until her eyes were swollen and her throat was raw. The boy she'd saved, the ghost boy who'd looked at her like she was an angel, the child who'd been dragged away in black SUVs while screaming promises that seemed impossible. He'd come back. He'd actually come back, and he'd bought the entire housing complex like he was purchasing groceries. Michelle didn't know whether to laugh or scream or both. By the time her shift ended at 6 a.m., word had spread through the projects about what was happening. Michelle's phone had 17 missed calls from Grandma Ruth, 6 from neighbors, and a dozen text messages ranging from concerned to terrified. The gist was the same. Men in suits had taken over the neighborhood, and somehow Michelle was connected to them. She drove home in her 15-year-old Honda with a check engine light that had been on for 3 months, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles ached. The morning sun was turning the sky orange and pink, but Michelle barely noticed. Her mind was spinning, trying to reconcile the skeletal child behind the fence with the man in the expensive suit who'd walked into her hospital like he owned the building. When she pulled into the parking lot at Building 7, she saw them immediately. Two men in suits standing near the entrance, not threatening anyone, just present. Watching. They nodded respectfully as she passed, like she was someone important rather than an exhausted nurse coming home from another brutal shift. Grandma Ruth was waiting in the apartment, sitting in her recliner with her arthritic hands folded in her lap and worry written across every line in her face. She'd been beautiful once. Michelle had seen the pictures from the 60s, Grandma Ruth in her nursing uniform looking confident and young. Now she was 73 and worn down by decades of poverty and loss, but her eyes were still sharp. "Baby," she said as soon as Michelle walked in, "what in the Lord's name is going on? There's Korean men in suits standing on every corner. People saying somebody bought the whole complex. Mrs. Chen says they shut down all of Big T's operations overnight, and Shanice's cousin heard your name mentioned." Michelle dropped her purse on the couch and sat down heavily. "It's complicated, Grandma." "Then uncomplicate it." So Michelle told her about the boy behind the fence 20 years ago, about feeding him for 3 months, about the black SUVs and his impossible promise, about last night at the hospital when that boy walked back into her life as a grown man with enough money to buy entire city blocks. Grandma Ruth listened without interrupting, her expression moving from confusion to understanding to something that looked like fear. When Michelle finished, the old woman was quiet for a long moment, just rocking slowly in her chair. "That boy you fed," Grandma Ruth said finally, "he became a gangster." "I think so, yeah. And now he's here because he thinks he owes you. He said he kept his promise, that he bought everything for me." Grandma Ruth closed her eyes. "Lord help us. Baby, do you understand what this means? Do you understand what kind of attention this brings?" Michelle understood. She'd been thinking about nothing else since Suck walked out of the hospital. The projects operated on a delicate ecosystem of power and fear. Big T controlled the drug trade because he was ruthless enough to hold territory and connected enough to get supply. The police mostly stayed out unless someone died publicly enough to require investigation. Residents survived by keeping their heads down and their mouths shut. Now someone had upset that entire balance. Someone with resources that made Big T look like a street corner amateur. And that someone claimed to be doing it for Michelle. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Michelle stared at it for 2 rings before answering. "Michelle," Suck's voice was calm, controlled. "I know you just got home, I know you're tired, but I'd like to talk. There's a coffee shop on Alameda, neutral ground. Can you meet me there in an hour?" Michelle wanted to say no, wanted to tell him to leave, to take his men in suits and his money and his complicated history back to wherever he'd come from. But she also needed answers. Needed to understand what he'd done and why and what it meant for her neighborhood. 1 hour, she said. The coffee shop was one of those gentrification indicators that had appeared in the past year, artisanal lattes and exposed brick and prices that made project residents walk past without entering. Michelle had never been inside. Couldn't justify spending $6 on coffee when Grandma Ruth's medication cost $300 a month even with insurance. Suck was waiting at a corner table, 2 cups already ordered. He stood when she entered, a gesture that seemed automatic, ingrained. He'd changed clothes but still wore a suit, this one dark gray with a subtle pinstripe. He looked like a businessman, like someone legitimate. But Michelle had grown up in the projects. She knew how to recognize danger even when it wore expensive fabric. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I got you a latte. If you don't like it, I can order something else." Michelle sat but didn't touch the coffee. "Tell me what you did, all of it." Suck's expression shifted, became more serious. "I bought the Riverside projects. The entire complex, all 8 buildings, the surrounding land, the parking structures. I own it. As of last week, I am the landlord for every resident in that neighborhood." "Why?" "Because I promised you I would." "I was 9 years old, Suck. You were dying. That wasn't a real promise, that was..." She stopped, trying to find the right words. "That was a fevered kid saying anything to make sense of what was happening." It was real to me. His voice was quiet but intense. For 20 years, every decision I made, every risk I took, every line I crossed, it was all to get strong enough, rich enough, powerful enough to come back and keep that promise. You saved my life, Michelle. You gave me food when you barely had enough for yourself. You saw me dying and you stopped. Nobody else stopped. Just you. Michelle's throat tightened. So you bought the projects. What else did you do? Suk was quiet for a moment, his fingers drumming once on the table. I secured the perimeter, made it clear that the neighborhood is under new management. The drug dealers, the gang members, the violence, all of it stops now. I have men positioned at every entrance and exit. No more drive-bys. No more kids getting shot on playgrounds. No more mothers crying over dead sons. How? By being scarier than the people who used to run it. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was discussing a business strategy rather than a hostile takeover. Big T and his crew operated through intimidation. They hurt people who didn't comply, killed people who challenged them. My organization does the same thing, just more efficiently. We let them know that their operations here are finished, that they can leave peacefully or leave in pieces, but either way, they're leaving. Michelle felt something cold settle in her stomach. What does leave in pieces mean? Suk met her eyes steadily. It means what you think it means. Jesus Christ. Michelle pushed back from the table. You're threatening to kill people, to murder them for me. Not for you, for the neighborhood, for the kids who are growing up in the same violence we grew up in, for the mothers who... Don't, Michelle's voice was sharp enough to cut. Don't you dare pretend this is altruism. You're a gangster, Suk. Maybe a rich one, maybe a powerful one, but still a gangster. You didn't come here to save the projects. You came here to collect on a debt you think I'm owed. That debt is real. And your method of paying it is what? Replacing one criminal organization with another. Big T sells drugs and hurts people. What do you do that's so different? Suk's jaw tightened. I provide order, structure, protection. Under my control, the projects will be safe. Safe, Michelle's laugh was bitter. Safe for who? The people living there, or safe for whatever operation you're planning to run? You think I don't know how this works. You think because I'm a nurse I'm naive about what men like you do. Men like me? Suk's voice had gone cold. You mean men who survived, who clawed their way up from nothing, who refused to die in gutters. I mean men who use violence as currency, who solve problems by hurting people, who think power gives them the right to control other people's lives. Michelle leaned forward, her exhaustion forgotten in the surge of anger. Do you know what happened 3 days ago? Big T came to my hospital and threatened me. Told me I had to steal drugs for him or he'd make me regret it. I said no because I'm not going to help poison my community, even if saying no might get me killed. That's the choice I made. That's who I am. And now you don't have to worry about Big T anymore, Suk said. He won't touch you, won't even look at you wrong, because my people have made it clear that you're under my protection. I don't want your protection. Michelle's voice rose enough that other customers glanced over. She lowered it with effort, her hands clenched into fists on the table. I don't want to be under anyone's protection. I want to live in a neighborhood where nurses don't get threatened and kids don't step over bodies on their way to school and mothers don't bury their sons before their sons are old enough to vote. But you haven't fixed any of that, Suk. You've just changed who's holding the gun. Suk reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. He slid it across the table. This is the deed to Building 7. Your building. It's in your name now. You own it, along with a trust that will cover all maintenance, utilities, and property taxes for the next 50 years. Michelle stared at the envelope like it was a snake. What? I told you I'd buy everything for you. The building where you live is yours, free and clear. You can do whatever you want with it, keep it, sell it, give it away. It's yours. Take it back. Michelle. Take it back. She pushed the envelope toward him so hard it slid off the table. Papers scattered across the coffee shop floor. I don't want your blood money. I don't want property you bought with whatever you did to get rich enough to buy it. And I definitely don't want to be the reason you turned my neighborhood into your territory. Suk's expression was unreadable. I did this for you. No. Michelle stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You did this for yourself. For that starving kid who got dragged away 20 years ago and spent 2 decades obsessing over a promise he should have forgotten. I fed you because you were dying and I had food. That's all it was. An act of basic human decency. It wasn't a marriage proposal. It wasn't a contract. It wasn't permission for you to reshape my entire life. You saved me. And apparently that was a mistake. The words came out harsher than Michelle intended, but she was too angry and exhausted to soften them. Because the boy I saved grew up to become exactly the kind of person I was fighting against. You didn't fix the neighborhood, suck. You just became the biggest bully on the block. She walked out before he could respond, leaving the spilled papers and the untouched latte and the ghost of a promise made by a dying child to a girl who'd thought kindness mattered. Outside, the morning sun was bright and harsh. Michelle's hands were shaking as she walked toward her car. She made it halfway across the parking lot before she had to stop, bracing herself against a light post, trying to breathe through the pressure in her chest. 20 years she'd wondered what happened to that boy, whether he'd survived, whether he'd found a family or a home or any kind of happiness. And now she had her answer. He'd survived by becoming a monster. He'd found power instead of love, and he'd convinced himself that buying buildings and threatening dealers was the same thing as keeping a promise. Michelle wanted to scream, wanted to cry, wanted to go back in time and tell her 9-year-old self to walk past that fence, to mind her own business, to let the dying boy die, because saving him had apparently set in motion a chain of events that led here, to this moment, to her neighborhood under siege by a man who thought violence was love. But she couldn't go back, could only go forward, could only figure out how to survive in a projects that now belonged to a ghost who'd grown teeth and forgotten what kindness actually meant. Her phone buzzed, text from an unknown number. I'm sorry you're angry, but I'm not leaving, and I'm not taking back what I've done. Whether you accept it or not, you're safe now. That's all that matters. S. Michelle deleted the message without responding. Then she got in her car and drove home to a building she apparently owned but had never wanted, in a neighborhood that had been purchased by a promise she'd never asked him to keep. Director Choi landed at Lax on a red-eye from Seoul, stepping off the plane with the kind of fury that made even immigration officials process him quickly and without questions. He'd spent the flight reviewing intelligence reports, financial statements, and surveillance footage that all confirmed what he'd suspected for months. Doc Suk had lost his mind over an American nurse who'd once given him leftover food. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so dangerous. Choi had served the Jumdo syndicate for 30 years, surviving 3 leadership transitions and countless internal purges. He'd been the one to retrieve that starving mongrel child from the projects 2 decades ago, acting on orders from Chairman Dokgo, who'd finally acknowledged his illegitimate grandson's existence. He'd watched Suk claw his way up from the basement, had even grudgingly respected the boy's ruthlessness. But respect and loyalty were different things, and Choi's loyalty had always been to the syndicate itself, not to whoever temporarily sat at its head. Suk's obsession with the American nurse was a weakness, and in their world, weakness was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. 3 SUVs were waiting at the airport, along with 8 men who'd flown in on earlier flights. These weren't the local Korean Americans Suk had recruited for his Riverside operation. These were soldiers from Seoul, men who'd bled for the syndicate long before Suk had learned to hold a gun. Men whose loyalty Choi had spent years cultivating through favors, money, and the promise that when the time came to remove the half-breed pretender from power, they would be rewarded. The convoy drove directly to a warehouse in Vernon, an industrial area where nobody asked questions about the kinds of businesses that operated behind chain-link fences and razor wire. Inside, Choi found exactly what he'd requested: a secure location, communication equipment, and most importantly, Big T. The local drug lord sat in a folding chair, trying to look relaxed despite the obvious tension in his shoulders. He was flanked by 2 of his crew, young men with red bandanas and expressions that oscillated between hostility and fear. Big T himself wore his usual abundance of gold jewelry, but the swagger he normally carried was absent. He understood he was out of his depth, sitting across from a man who made Korean headlines disappear and whose organization counted body counts in the hundreds. Choi dismissed his own men with a gesture, leaving only his personal bodyguard, a scarred veteran named Park who'd been breaking bones for the syndicate since Big T was in elementary school. The message was clear. I don't need an army to handle you. Mr. Thompson, Choi said, his English heavily accented but precise. He'd learned the language specifically for syndicate operations in America, treating it like any other weapon in his arsenal. Thank you for accepting my invitation. Didn't feel much like an invitation, Big T said, trying to inject some of his street authority into his voice. More like I didn't have a choice. Quite right, you didn't. Choi sat down across from him, his movements economical and controlled. Let me be direct, as I understand Americans appreciate directness. Dora'sArchives has invaded your territory, disrupted your business operations, and established control over the Riverside projects through superior force. This has cost you money and respect. Yes. Big T's jaw tightened. Yeah, that's one way to put it. He has done this not for strategic advantage or profit, but because of a woman, a nurse who works at City General Hospital. Michelle James, you know her. Something flickered in Big T's eyes. Recognition and something else, resentment, maybe, or unfinished business. I know her. She's from the neighborhood. Acts like she's better than everybody else because she got a nursing degree. You have had dealings with her. Tried to. She refused to cooperate with a business opportunity I offered. Thought she could just say no to me without consequences. Big T's voice carried the particular offense of a man accustomed to compliance through intimidation. Was planning to teach her some manners, but then your boy showed up and suddenly I got bigger problems. Choi nodded slowly, processing this information. This woman, Michelle James, is the reason Dora'sArchives purchased the entire housing complex. The reason he deployed 40 armed men to your neighborhood. The reason he has disrupted months of established operations and created a situation that now requires my personal attention. He paused, letting that sink in. She is his weakness, and in my experience, the fastest way to kill a man is to attack his weakness. Big T leaned forward, interest overcoming caution. You saying what I think you're saying. I am saying that Dora'sArchives has made a critical error. He has allowed sentiment to cloud his judgment. He believes he can play at being a savior, buying buildings and clearing streets like he is some character in an American movie. This makes him vulnerable. Choi's voice was clinical, discussing Suk's downfall the way a doctor might discuss removing a tumor. Remove the woman and you remove his anchor. He will become reckless, emotional. He will make mistakes. And when he does, I will be there to correct those mistakes permanently. So you want me to grab the nurse? Big T was nodding now, the pieces falling into place. Use her as bait to draw him out. Not precisely. I want you to hurt her. Badly enough that Dora'sArchives understands his protection means nothing. Badly enough that he loses control and reveals the full extent of his operation, which will give me the justification I need to remove him from leadership. The syndicate elders in Seoul are already concerned about his unauthorized American expansion. If he escalates into open warfare over a woman, they will authorize his elimination. Big T was quiet for a moment, calculating risks and rewards. What's in it for me? When Dora'sArchives is gone, I will withdraw all syndicate presence from the Riverside projects. The territory will revert to you, with the understanding that a portion of your profits will be directed to our organization as a consultancy fee. Additionally, I will provide you with access to our distribution network, pharmaceutical-grade product at prices your current suppliers cannot match. Your operation will be larger and more profitable than it has ever been. It was a good offer. Too good, actually, which should have made Big T suspicious. But men like him, men who'd grown up fighting for scraps in neighborhoods designed to keep them contained, rarely looked past the immediate opportunity. They saw the prize without calculating the price. When do we move? Big T asked. Choi smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Tonight, while Dora'sArchives is meeting with his American contacts about property acquisitions, he will be occupied for hours far from the projects. His attention will be divided. That is when we strike. How hard we going? Hard enough to send a message. She is a nurse, yes. She understands pain, understands recovery. Make sure she understands both intimately. Choi stood, the meeting clearly concluded. My men will provide surveillance and ensure Dokgo's security detail remains occupied elsewhere. The execution is yours. Show me that you deserve to keep your territory. Big T stood as well, extending his hand. Choi looked at it for a moment before shaking, a gesture that felt less like partnership and more like a transaction between a buyer and merchandise. As Big T and his crew left the warehouse, Choi turned to Park. He won't survive the week, Choi said in Korean. Once Dokgo is eliminated, remove Thompson as well. He's too stupid to be useful long-term and he knows too much. Park nodded, and the woman. If she survives Thompson's attention, I'll handle her myself. Dokgo needs to watch her die, needs to understand that sentiment is poison in our world. It will be educational for the younger soldiers, a reminder of what happens when you forget that business is business. They spent the next several hours coordinating. Choi's team hacked into the security system Dokgo had installed throughout the Riverside projects, creating blind spots and false feeds that would give Big T's crew a window to operate. They monitored Dokgo's location via the GPS tracker embedded in his vehicle. They confirmed that Michelle James was scheduled to work a night shift at City General, which meant she'd be leaving her apartment around 7 p.m. Everything aligned perfectly. Too perfectly, perhaps, but Choi had learned long ago that fortune favored the prepared. And he'd been preparing for this moment since Dokgo had announced his insane plan to buy an American housing complex for sentimental reasons. Big T gathered his crew at their usual spot, an abandoned auto shop 3 blocks from the projects. He'd assembled 8 men, all of them veterans of the street wars that defined Riverside's hierarchy. They were armed with bats, crowbars, and 2 pistols. Big T didn't want anyone dead, not yet. Death brought cops and investigations. But broken bones, burned property, that was just another Tuesday in the projects. Here's how this goes down, Big T said, laying out his phone with photos of Michelle James that his crew had pulled from social media. This bitch thinks she's untouchable now that she's got Korean bodyguards. We gonna show her different. We gonna show Dokgo that his money don't mean shit on our blocks. One of his crew, a young man named Marcus who'd grown up 3 buildings away from Michelle, shifted uncomfortably. Man, I don't know about this. Michelle never did nothing to nobody. She's just trying to help people. Big T's expression hardened. She disrespected me, refused a direct order. And now she's the reason we got suits standing on our corners, the reason we can't work, the reason we losing money every day. You want to keep earning, or you want to defend some stuck-up nurse who thinks she's better than us. Marcus went quiet, but his discomfort was visible. Big T noted it, filed it away as something to address later. Dissent couldn't be tolerated, especially not now. They waited until 7:15, when Michelle would be walking to her car in the apartment building's small parking lot. Choi's people had confirmed that Dokgo's security team had been called away to handle a disturbance on the opposite end of the complex. A disturbance Choi had arranged, of course. The window would be narrow, maybe 5 minutes, but that was all they needed. Michelle emerged from Building 7 exactly on schedule, wearing her scrubs and carrying her worn purse. She looked exhausted, the way she always did before a shift, her shoulders carrying the weight of too many double shifts and too many patients she couldn't save. She was alone, vulnerable. Big T's crew moved from the shadows like wolves, closing on wounded prey. Michelle saw them when she was 10 feet from her Honda. Her body went rigid, her nurse's instinct for danger triggering every warning system she'd developed through years in the projects. She pivoted toward the building entrance, but 2 of Big T's crew had already circled behind her, cutting off retreat. She was trapped in the parking lot with 8 men and nowhere to run. "Evening, Michelle," Big T said, his voice carrying that particular false friendliness that preceded violence. "You and me need to have a conversation about respect." Michelle's hand went to her purse, probably reaching for her phone. Marcus grabbed it from her grip, throwing it aside where it clattered against the pavement. She didn't scream, another survival instinct from the projects, understanding that screaming brought attention but rarely help. "I don't want trouble, Terrell." Her voice was steady despite the fear Michelle must have been feeling. "Just let me go to work." "See, that's the problem. You think you can just go about your business like you didn't bring hell down on this whole neighborhood, like you didn't refuse me when I made you a generous offer." Big T stepped closer, towering over her. "You think because you got that Korean gangster protecting you, you're untouchable. Time to learn different." The first blow came from behind, a crowbar to the back of Michelle's knee that dropped her to the asphalt with a cry of pain she couldn't suppress. The second was a bat across her shoulder, the crack audible even from where Choi watched through the surveillance feed he'd hacked into. Michelle tried to crawl toward her car, survival instinct overriding the pain. Big T's boot caught her in the ribs, flipping her onto her back. She looked up at the men surrounding her, and Choi could see the exact moment calculation replaced panic in her eyes. She was a nurse. She knew exactly what they were about to do to her body and what the damage would mean. "Please," she said, and the word cost her everything. "Please don't do this." Big T crouched beside her, grabbed her jaw. "Should have thought about that before you said no to me. Should have thought about your grandmother in 7C who's gonna wonder why you don't come home. Should have thought about—" Michelle spat in his face. The violence that followed was systematic and brutal. They worked her over with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before, avoiding her head and organs but ensuring maximum pain and injury. Broken ribs, shattered collarbone. Her left arm bent at an angle that made Choi wince despite his decades of witnessing violence. Through it all, Michelle made sounds, gasps and cries, and once, heartbreakingly, a whispered, "Grandma, I'm sorry." But she didn't beg again. Didn't offer them the satisfaction of breaking her spirit, along with her body. After 2 minutes that must have felt eternal, Big T pulled his crew back. Michelle lay on the asphalt, curled into a protective ball, blood pooling beneath her from wounds Choi couldn't fully see through the surveillance camera. Big T pulled out a bottle of lighter fluid and poured it over Michelle's Honda, then lit a match. The car went up in flames with a whoosh of igniting gasoline. The fire reflected off the parking lot's puddles, turning everything orange and hellish. Big T stood over Michelle's broken form, silhouetted against the flames, and said something Choi couldn't hear but could read on his lips. "Tell your Korean boyfriend he don't own shit." Then they were gone, melting back into the project's shadows with the practiced ease of men who knew every alley and escape route. Choi closed the laptop displaying the surveillance feed. Across from him, Park waited for orders. Outside the warehouse, he could hear the distant wail of sirens. Someone had called 911 about the car fire. Ambulances would arrive. Michelle James would be taken to City General, the hospital where she worked. And Doc Go-suk would receive the news that, while he was across town playing real estate developer, his precious nurse had been beaten half to death in a parking lot his security was supposed to be protecting. Director Choi permitted himself a small smile. "Contact our people at the hospital. I want detailed reports on her condition and Doc Go's response. And activate the secondary team. When Doc Go retaliates, and he will retaliate, I want to know his every move." Park bowed slightly. "And if he comes after Big T directly?" Let him unleash whatever violence he's been restraining. The more bodies he stacks, the more justified his removal becomes." Choi stood, straightening his suit jacket. "Sentiment is a cancer in our organization. Tonight we begin the operation to cut it out." 4 miles away, in the parking lot of Building 7, residents were finally emerging from their apartments to find Michelle James unconscious beside her burning vehicle. Someone had already called an ambulance. Grandma Ruth stood on her third-floor balcony, her arthritic hands gripping the railing, her screams audible over the crackling flames. Neighbors who'd known Michelle since she was 9 years old stood in shocked silence, their phones recording the scene, but none of them having moved to help until it was too late. The projects had turned a blind eye again, the way they always did. The way they'd done when Suk was dragged into black SUVs. The way they did when violence came because getting involved meant becoming the next target. But this time, the violence wasn't random. This time, it was calculated. This time, it was designed specifically to provoke a monster into revealing his true nature. And monsters, once provoked, rarely stopped until everything in their path was destroyed. The phone call came while Doc Go-suk was reviewing acquisition papers for 3 commercial properties on the eastern edge of Riverside. His attorney was mid-sentence about zoning restrictions when Suk's secure line buzzed, the one only his inner circle had access to. He picked it up without apologizing to the lawyer, his instincts already screaming that something had gone catastrophically wrong. "Boss," it was Jinwoo, one of his most trusted men, and his voice carried the kind of carefully controlled panic that made Suk's blood go cold. "There's been an incident at the projects. Michelle James was attacked in her parking lot. They beat her and burned her car. Ambulance took her to City General 20 minutes ago." The acquisition papers slipped from Suk's fingers, scattering across the conference table like fallen leaves. The attorney said something about needing signatures, but the words were just noise now, meaningless sounds from a world that had suddenly become irrelevant. Suk's mind was already moving, calculating, the cold, tactical part of his brain that had kept him alive through 2 decades of syndicate warfare kicking into overdrive. "How bad?" His voice was eerily calm, the way it always got right before violence. "Bad, multiple fractures, internal bleeding. She's in surgery now. Boss, I'm sorry, we were pulled to the north perimeter for a disturbance. It was a setup. Someone coordinated this." "Choi," the name came out like a curse. Of course it was Choi. The old bastard had been too quiet since Suk announced the American expansion, had offered too little resistance to what should have been seen as a reckless deviation from syndicate protocol. Suk had been so focused on Michelle, on fulfilling his promise, that he'd ignored the obvious threat consolidating behind him. "We've got eyes on Big T and his crew. They're holed up in an abandoned factory off Soto Street, the old textile plant. They're celebrating, boss, drinking and laughing about what they did to her." Suk was already moving, his hand reaching for the DWK-5 he kept in a shoulder holster beneath his jacket. The pistol felt heavier than usual, or maybe that was just his rage making everything feel weighted, significant. His thumb traced the outline of Michelle's subway token taped to the grip, that rusted piece of metal that had traveled across oceans and through years of blood. She'd given it to him so he'd remember that somebody loved him. Now she was on an operating table, because he'd been arrogant enough to think he could protect her just by buying buildings and posting guards. "How many?" Suk asked, his mind already mapping the factory's layout from memory. He'd used that location himself years ago for a different operation, knew its loading docks and catwalks and the way sound echoed off the high ceilings. "We count 15, maybe 20. Big T's core crew plus some Korean faces we don't recognize. Could be Choi's people from Seoul. 20 men. 20 men who'd put their hands on Michelle. 20 men who thought they could hurt her and survive the consequences. The rage that rose in Suk's chest was so pure it almost felt cleansing, like white fire burning away every strategic consideration except one, complete annihilation. "Don't engage," Suk ordered. "Pull everyone back. I want the factory surrounded but nobody goes in. Nobody interferes, understood?" "Boss, 20-1 odds." "I said nobody interferes." Suk ended the call and looked at the attorney still sitting at the conference table, confusion written across his face. "We're done here. Get out." The lawyer scrambled to gather his papers and fled without argument. Smart man. He'd probably seen enough in Suk's eyes to understand that staying would mean witnessing something no civilian should see. Suk made 2 more calls. The first to the hospital, speaking directly to the chief of surgery and making it clear that Michelle James would receive every resource they had. That money was no object, that if she died on that table, there would be consequences. The second call was to his weapons supplier, a former Special Forces operative who kept an arsenal in a storage unit and didn't ask questions about legality or intent. 30 minutes later, Suk stood in that storage unit loading magazines with methodical precision. He'd stripped off the expensive suit jacket and tie, now wearing just black tactical pants and a tight black shirt that wouldn't restrict movement. The DWK-5 went into his shoulder holster, a Kabar combat knife strapped to his thigh, 2 flashbang grenades clipped to his belt. He considered body armor but rejected it. This wasn't about survival. It was about sending a message written in blood and screaming. The factory squatted on the edge of an industrial zone where Soto Street dissolved into chain-link fences and abandoned lots. 3 stories of corroded metal and broken windows, the kind of building cities forgot about until developers decided the land was valuable enough to bulldoze. Suk's SUV rolled past the perimeter where his men had established a loose cordon, and he caught Jinwoo's eye through the tinted window. Jinwoo's expression was grim but understanding. He'd served under Suk long enough to know that some situations required the boss to handle things personally, that some messages could only be delivered in person. Suk parked 50 yards from the factory's main entrance and sat for a moment in the darkness, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He could still turn back, could call his entire force, surround the building properly, extract Michelle if she was even inside, or simply execute everyone in the factory from a distance with snipers. That would be the smart play, the tactical play, the kind of decision a syndicate boss was supposed to make. But Suk wasn't feeling particularly smart or tactical. He was feeling like the starving boy who'd watched Michelle get smaller in that rear window as the SUVs drove him away, who'd promised her everything and delivered only danger. He was feeling like every broken promise and every drop of blood he'd spilled to get powerful enough to keep his word had been wasted if he couldn't even keep her safe in her own parking lot. He stepped out of the vehicle and started walking toward the factory. The main entrance was a loading dock with a rusted metal door hanging half open. Suk could hear voices inside, laughter and music from someone's phone playing trap music too loudly. The celebration Jinwoo had mentioned. They actually thought they'd won, that hurting Michelle would somehow protect them from the consequences of touching something that belonged to Dokgo Suk. He pulled the factory door fully open and stepped inside. The space was exactly as he remembered, vast and hollow, with support columns rising to a ceiling lost in shadows. The floor was cracked concrete littered with debris from decades of abandonment. Industrial equipment rusted in corners like the skeletons of metal beasts. In the center of it all, Big T and his crew had set up a makeshift party, sitting on overturned crates around a barrel fire, passing bottles and joints, and reenacting their assault on Michelle with the kind of proud detail that made Suk's vision narrow to pinpoints. They didn't notice him at first. The music was too loud, their celebration too raucous. But one of the younger ones, the kid who'd been uncomfortable during Big T's planning session, glanced toward the entrance and went absolutely still. His face drained of color as he recognized the man standing in the doorway like death personified. "Boss," the kid whispered, and the word cut through the music and laughter like a blade. Everyone turned. Big T was halfway through a story about the sound Michelle's ribs made when he'd kicked her, but the words died in his throat as he saw Suk standing there alone, backlit by the streetlights outside. For a moment, nobody moved. The music kept playing, some bass-heavy track about money and power, creating a surreal soundtrack to the tableau of predators suddenly realizing they were looking at an apex predator. Big T recovered first, his street instincts telling him that confidence was the only play left. He stood up slowly, his hand moving casually toward the pistol at his waistband. "Well, shit, the big man himself. Heard you were busy signing papers and playing real estate mogul. What brings you to our little party?" Suk reached behind him and pulled the factory door closed. The metal shrieked against the frame before slamming shut with a boom that echoed through the space. Then he slid a rusted iron bar through the handles, locking it from the inside. The sound of that bar sliding into place had a finality to it, like a coffin being nailed shut. "Nobody leaves," Suk said quietly. His voice was barely above a conversational tone, but somehow it carried across the entire factory. "Not until we've settled accounts." "You think you can take all of us?" Big T laughed, but it sounded forced. He was scanning the shadows, looking for the backup that had to be there because nobody was stupid enough to walk into this situation alone. "You crazy, man. There's 20 of us and one of you." "I know." Suk started walking toward them, his footsteps echoing on the concrete. "I counted." That's when Big T saw his eyes, really saw them. And whatever he recognized there made him forget about posturing and go straight for his gun. He was fast. Years of street warfare had given Big T quick hands and quicker instincts. The pistol cleared his waistband in a smooth draw, his finger already moving to the trigger. But Suk was faster. He'd spent 20 years training for moments exactly like this, had killed his first man at 16 and hadn't stopped refining the craft since. His Daewoo 5 appeared in his hand like magic, and he put a round through Big T's shoulder before the dealer could even aim properly. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space, the muzzle flash painting everything in stark white light for a fraction of a second. Big T's pistol clattered to the concrete as he spun backward, clutching his shattered shoulder, screaming. Then chaos erupted. Big T's crew went for their weapons, a mix of pistols, knives, and the bats they'd used on Michelle. The Korean men who'd been sitting separately from the local crew rose as one unit, moving with the coordinated precision that marked them as Choi's soldiers. They had real training, real experience, and they spread out in a tactical formation designed to create crossfire and eliminate a single target through overwhelming force. Suk threw himself behind a support column as bullets chewed into the concrete where he'd been standing. He counted shots by sound alone, 3 9mm, 2 45s, all firing too quickly, adrenaline making them waste ammunition. He waited until there was a lull for reloading, then emerged from cover and put down 2 of Big T's crew with headshots so precise they could have been training exercises. The Korean soldiers were more disciplined. They'd taken cover behind machinery and were coordinating their fire, trying to pin Suk down and flank him. One of them barked orders in Korean, a tactical maneuver Suk recognized from his own training. They were good, professional. Under normal circumstances, they might have actually won. But these weren't normal circumstances. Suk wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting to erase. He pulled one of the flashbangs from his belt and threw it toward the Korean position. The grenade bounced once, twice, then detonated with a concussive blast that turned the factory into a strobe light of white phosphorus. The Korean soldiers staggered, their vision compromised, their hearing shot. Suk moved through the confusion like a ghost, his knife appearing in his hand as he closed the distance. The first soldier never saw him coming. Suk's blade found the gap between his ribs, angled upward toward the heart, and the man dropped without even crying out. The second one managed to turn, managed to raise his pistol, but Suk batted it aside and drove the knife into his throat. Hot blood sprayed across Suk's face and chest, but he was already moving, already hunting the next target. Big T's crew had scattered, trying to find cover in the vast space. The smart ones were running toward the exits, the fire doors and windows that offered escape from this nightmare. But Suk had planned for that. His men were outside those exits, not to help but to ensure nobody left. The factory had become a killing box, and everyone inside was already dead. They just didn't know it yet. Marcus, the young one who'd hesitated during the planning, had hidden behind an overturned forklift. Suk found him there, trembling, his pistol on the ground beside him like he'd made the conscious choice not to fight. Their eyes met in the darkness, and Suk saw something in the kid's face that might have been remorse or terror or both. "I didn't want to," Marcus whispered. "I didn't want to hurt her. Big T said we had to, said." "You were there," Suk said. "You watched, that's enough." The shot echoed through the factory, and Marcus slumped against the forklift, a small mercy compared to what Suk was doing to the others. The Korean soldiers had regrouped, their training overcoming their shock. They'd formed a defensive position near the eastern wall, using industrial equipment as cover, and were laying down suppressive fire that kept Suk from advancing directly. These were veterans, men who'd survived syndicate wars in Seoul. They weren't going to die easily. Suk holstered his pistol and pulled out the second flashbang, but instead of throwing it at their position, he threw it at the support column nearest to them. The grenade bounced off the metal and rolled into the machinery they were hiding behind before detonating in a blast that sent shrapnel and metal fragments tearing through their position like invisible blades. 2 of them went down screaming, their bodies shredded by the improvised fragmentation. The third managed to stay on his feet, his face a mask of blood from a cut across his forehead. He raised his pistol with shaking hands, trying to draw a bead on Suk through vision that had to be compromised. Suk walked toward him slowly, deliberately, not even bothering to take cover. The Korean soldier fired 3 times, but his hands were shaking too badly and the rounds went wide, sparking off metal behind Suk. When the pistol clicked empty, the soldier just stood there, swaying, waiting for death to arrive. "Choi sent you," Suk said in Korean. It wasn't a question. The soldier nodded once, blood dripping from his chin. "Tell him in hell that it wasn't enough." The knife found his heart on the first thrust. Suk held him there for a moment, watching the life drain from his eyes before letting the body fall. The factory had gone quiet except for groaning from the wounded and the crackle of the barrel fire still burning in the center of the space. Suk reloaded his pistol methodically, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. He'd lost count of how many he'd killed. 10, 12. It didn't matter. There were still more. He found 3 of Big T's crew hiding in what used to be the factory's office space, a second-floor room with windows overlooking the main floor. They'd barricaded the door and were trying to call for help on their phones, but Suk had already had Jinwoo jam all cell signals within a half-mile radius. Nobody was coming. Nobody was leaving. This was between him and the men who'd touched Michelle. Suk didn't bother with the door. He climbed the exterior of the building using the rusted fire escape, came through one of the broken windows, and was inside the office before they even realized he'd flanked them. The close-quarters fight that followed was brutal and brief. No room for guns, just fists and elbows, and the knife doing terrible work in the cramped space. When it was over, Suk stood among the bodies breathing hard, his clothes soaked with blood that wasn't his own. His knuckles were split. His right shoulder ached from where someone had hit him with a bat. But he was alive, and they weren't, and that was all that mattered. He descended the metal stairs to the main floor, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Big T was still alive, propped against a wall and clutching his shattered shoulder, his face gray with shock and blood loss. The dealer's eyes tracked Suk's approach with the dull recognition of someone who understood exactly what was about to happen. "You're insane," Big T gasped. "You killed all these people over some bitch who don't even want you." Suk crouched down in front of him, close enough to see the fear in Big T's eyes despite the bravado. "Her name is Michelle, and she's worth more than every life I took tonight, worth more than yours, worth more than mine. Choi's gonna kill you for this. He's gonna." "Let him try." Suk pressed the Daewoo against Big T's forehead, right between his eyes. "Any last words?" Big T spat at him. It was weak, barely landing, the final defiant gesture of a man who'd built his reputation on cruelty and was dying in a pool of his own blood. Suk pulled the trigger, and Big T's head snapped back against the wall, leaving a dark stain that would never quite wash out. The factory was a charnel house. Bodies scattered across the floor like discarded toys, blood pooling in the cracks of the concrete, the smell of cordite and death thick enough to taste. Suk stood in the center of it all, his chest heaving, his hands shaking with the aftershock of violence. This was who he'd become. This was what Michelle's kindness had purchased with that cornbread 20 years ago, a monster who could walk into a building with 20 armed men and emerge as the only one breathing. He heard movement from the shadows and spun, his pistol rising before his conscious mind even registered the threat. But it wasn't another attacker. It was Michelle. She stood in the doorway he'd barred earlier, the iron barrier somehow removed, leaning heavily against the frame. Her left arm was in a sling. Her face was bruised and swollen. She wore a hospital gown under a jacket someone had given her. And she was barefoot because she'd apparently walked out of surgery and somehow made it here. Her eyes swept across the carnage, taking in the bodies and blood with the clinical assessment of a nurse who'd seen trauma before, but never quite like this. "Michelle," Suk's voice cracked on her name. "You shouldn't be here. You should be in the hospital. You need." "I know what I need." Her voice was hoarse from screaming earlier, from the pain that had to be tearing through her broken body with every breath. I need to understand what you are, what I created when I fed that boy through the fence." Suk took a step toward her and she flinched. Actually flinched, like he was the threat now, like the man covered in blood was more terrifying than the men who'd put her in that hospital bed. The gesture hit him harder than any bullet could have. "I did this for you," he said, and even to his own ears it sounded like a plea. "They hurt you. They needed to pay." 20 people are dead. Michelle's eyes were bright with tears and something else. Horror, maybe, or recognition that the ghost boy she'd saved had become exactly the kind of monster the projects created. "You killed 20 people because they hurt me. Do you understand how insane that is?" "I understand that they touched you, that they broke your bones and laughed about it, that they thought they could hurt you and walk away." Suk's hand tightened on his pistol. "I understand that every single one of them deserved what they got. And when Choi sends 40 men instead of 20, when he burns down the whole neighborhood to get to you, when innocent people die because you can't separate revenge from justice." Michelle's voice was rising despite the pain it had to be causing her damaged ribs. "You haven't saved me, Suk. You've painted a target on my back that will never come off." Suk had no answer for that, because she was right. This wasn't protection, it was escalation. Every body in this factory was another step toward a war that would consume everyone around them. But he couldn't regret it, wouldn't regret it. The men who'd hurt Michelle were dead, and if he had to kill 100 more to keep her safe, he'd do it without hesitation. "I kept my promise," he said finally. "I came back. I bought everything. I'll burn down the whole world if that's what it takes to protect you." Michelle looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable through the bruising and tears. "That's not what I wanted. That boy I fed, he was gentle, scared, human. I don't know who you are anymore." She turned and limped away into the darkness outside, leaving Suk standing alone in the factory full of corpses, covered in blood, holding a promise that had cost him his humanity and still somehow wasn't enough. Michelle made it 3 blocks before her legs gave out. The adrenaline that had carried her from the hospital bed to the factory, fueled by sheer terror when Jinwoo told her where Suk had gone and what he was doing, finally crashed, leaving her gasping against a chain-link fence with her broken ribs screaming and her vision tunneling to pinpoints. She would have collapsed completely if Jinwoo hadn't caught her, his expression torn between professional duty to protect his boss and human concern for the woman his boss had just massacred 20 people to avenge. "We need to get you back to the hospital," Jinwoo said, already reaching for his phone. "No," Michelle's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried enough force to make him pause. "Take me home to Grandma's apartment and bring him." Jinwoo understood immediately who him was. "Miss James, the boss is not in a good state right now. What he just did, what he became in that factory." "I know what he is." Michelle's eyes were hard despite the tears still tracking through the bruises on her face. "I've always known. I just needed to see it. Now bring him to me. That's not a request." 20 minutes later, Suk stood outside apartment 7C with blood drying on his clothes and the weight of 20 bodies pressing down on his conscience. Jinwoo had driven him here in silence, had handed him a clean shirt that Suk had refused to put on because he needed Michelle to see exactly what her kindness had purchased. He needed her to understand that the boy she'd saved had become something that solved problems with bullets and blades, and that no amount of expensive suits or purchased real estate could change that fundamental truth. He knocked. The sound seemed too soft, too civilized for hands that had just killed without hesitation or mercy. Grandma Ruth opened the door. She was 73 years old and had survived 7 decades in neighborhoods designed to break people like her, so she didn't gasp or scream when she saw the blood. She just looked at Suk with eyes that had witnessed too much violence to be shocked anymore and said quietly, "She's waiting for you in the kitchen, and you better not track that mess on my clean floors." Suk removed his shoes, an automatic gesture from his Korean upbringing that felt absurd given the circumstances, and walked barefoot through the apartment. It was small, cramped, decorated with 40 years of accumulated life in a place where nothing got thrown away because you never knew when you'd need it again. Family photos on the walls showing Michelle at every age, from gap-toothed child to exhausted nurse. A cross above the television. The smell of menthol ointment and the faint ghost of that morning's breakfast. Michelle sat at the kitchen table, her injured arm still in its sling, her other hand wrapped around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. She'd changed out of the hospital gown into sweatpants, and one of those oversized shirts nurses wore when they were off duty, trying to forget the trauma they witnessed during their shifts. Her face was a canvas of bruises, purple and yellow and sick green, and Suck felt something crack in his chest at the sight of damage he hadn't been able to prevent. "Sit down," she said, not looking at him. "You're bleeding." Suck glanced down and realized she was right. His right side was dark with blood seeping through the shirt, the result of a knife wound he'd barely registered during the fight. One of the Korean soldiers had gotten closer than Suck thought, had managed to slice through the muscle along his ribs before dying. It wasn't deep enough to be fatal, but it needed attention. He sat down across from her, the kitchen chair creaking under his weight. Michelle finally looked up, and her expression was impossible to read, anger and grief, and something else that might have been disappointed understanding. "Take off your shirt," she said. "Michelle, you shouldn't, your injuries." "I'm a nurse. I've sutured wounds with pneumonia and 102 fever. I can handle this." Her voice was clinical, professional, the tone she probably used with patients who were dying but needed to believe they'd survive. "Shirt off now." Suck complied, peeling the blood-soaked fabric away from the wound and dropping it on the kitchen floor. Michelle stood carefully, favoring her broken ribs, and retrieved a first aid kit from under the sink. The kit was extensive: gauze, an antiseptic, and actual suture thread, the kind of supplies a nurse kept at home, because she knew the people in her building couldn't afford emergency room visits for injuries that weren't immediately life-threatening. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic that burned like liquid fire. Suck didn't flinch, didn't make a sound, just stared at the wall while Michelle worked with the focused intensity of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Her hands were steady despite everything, muscle memory overriding pain and trauma. "You're lucky," she said quietly, threading the needle. "Another inch to the left and he'd have punctured your lung. You'd have drowned in your own blood on that factory floor. Would have saved everyone a lot of trouble." Michelle's hands stilled. Don't you dare make jokes about dying after what you just put me through. After I had to watch Jinwoo's face when he told me you'd gone to that factory alone, after I had to imagine what they'd do to you if they won." Her voice cracked. "After I had to see what you did to them because they hurt me." The first suture pierced his skin and Suck welcomed the pain, needed it as some kind of penance for the chasm that had opened between them. Michelle worked in silence, each stitch precise and efficient, closing the wound with the same care she'd probably used on hundreds of patients who never knew her name. When she finished, she taped gauze over the stitches and stepped back, swaying slightly. Suck caught her elbow, steadying her, and for a moment they were close enough that he could smell the hospital antiseptic still clinging to her skin beneath the borrowed shirt. "Why did you leave the hospital?" he asked. "You could have died." "Walking out in your condition, the infection risk alone." "Because I needed to stop you before you became something you couldn't come back from." Michelle pulled away from his grip and sat down heavily, her breathing labored. "I've seen what happens when men like you go to war. I've sutured the collateral damage. Children hit by stray bullets, mothers who tried to shield their bobbies and failed, entire families destroyed because they lived on the wrong block when the shooting started. I would never." "You killed 20 people tonight, Suck." She said it flatly, a statement of fact. 20 human beings who had families and friends and people who'll miss them, regardless of what they did to me. And I know. She held up her hand when he tried to interrupt. "I know they hurt me. I know they deserved punishment. But death, all of them, was that justice or just revenge dressed up to look like protection?" Suck had no answer that wouldn't sound like an excuse, so he told her the truth. "It was what I am, what soul made me, what I had to become to survive long enough to keep my promise to you." "That promise?" Michelle's laugh was bitter, painful. "That goddamn promise. You were 9 years old, Suck, starving and traumatized and being dragged away by men in suits. I never expected you to remember me, let alone spend 20 years building an empire just to come back and buy buildings. But I did remember, every single day, through beatings and betrayals and becoming exactly the kind of monster the syndicate needed. I remembered the girl who stopped when everyone else kept walking, who shared her food when she barely had enough, who looked at me like I mattered." Suck's voice dropped to something raw and honest. You saved my life, Michelle, not just by feeding me, by making me believe that somewhere in this brutal world, kindness still existed. That gave me something to hold on to when everything else was trying to break me. And what did that kindness turn you into? Michelle gestured toward his blood-stained clothes. A killer, a crime lord, someone who solves problems with violence because that's all he knows anymore. Yes, Suk met her eyes steadily. That's exactly what it turned me into, and I won't apologize for it because that violence is what bought your safety, what cleared the dealers off your corners, what made sure Big T will never threaten you again. But at what cost? Michelle's voice rose despite the pain it caused. You think Choi's going to just accept this? You killed his soldiers, disrupted his coup. He's going to come back with everything he has, and when he does, this whole neighborhood becomes a war zone. You haven't saved us, Suk. You've condemned us. The words hit harder than any blade, because she was right. Suk had been so focused on his promise, on proving to Michelle that the boy she'd saved had become someone worthy of that salvation, that he'd ignored the larger strategic picture. Choi wouldn't accept this loss. The Seoul elders wouldn't tolerate an American operation that generated this much violence and attention. The FBI and local police would start investigating the massacre at the factory, and those investigations would lead back to the projects, to Michelle, to everyone Suk was trying to protect. He'd won the battle, but guaranteed a war that would consume everyone he cared about. Then I'll leave, Suk said quietly. I'll dissolve the operation, pull my people out, return to Seoul. You'll be safe. Will I? Michelle's eyes were wet with tears she refused to let fall. You really think Choi won't use me as leverage once you're gone? That every ambitious soldier in your organization won't see me as a way to hurt you? You've tied my fate to yours, Suk. There's no walking away now. They sat in silence, the kitchen clock ticking away seconds that felt like a countdown to something inevitable and terrible. Outside, Riverside was quieter than it had been in years. No sirens, no gunshots, just the hum of traffic on distant streets. Suk's intervention had brought a kind of peace to the projects, but it was the peace of a boot on a throat, temporary, and sustained only through the threat of overwhelming violence. There's another way, Michelle said finally. A way that doesn't involve you ruling this neighborhood through fear or leaving me exposed when you're gone. What way? You use your money legally. You invest in the community instead of controlling it. You rebuild the schools, fix the hospital, create jobs that aren't connected to crime. You stop being a gangster playing savior and become an actual investor who gives a damn about the people living here. She leaned forward despite the pain, her eyes intense. You have the resources, Suk. You could change everything without firing another shot, but it means giving up the violence. It means trusting systems instead of fear. Suk wanted to argue that systems didn't work, that the only language the streets understood was power, that legal investment couldn't protect Michelle from men like Choi who operated outside any law. But he looked at her face, at the bruises and determination, and hoped that somehow still survived despite everything, and realized she was offering him something more valuable than victory. She was offering him redemption, a chance to become someone other than the monster Seoul had created, a chance to prove that the boy she'd saved could still remember what kindness looked like. If I do this, he said slowly, if I go legitimate and invest legally, Choi still needs to be handled. The syndicate still needs to understand that you're untouchable. Then handle it, one last time. Do what you have to do to protect yourself and by extension me. But after that, Michelle reached across the table and placed her hand over his, her skin warm against his blood-stained fingers. After that, you build instead of destroying. You create instead of controlling. You become the person that a 9-year-old boy could have been if the world had been kinder. It was an impossible ask. Men like Suk didn't retire, didn't go legitimate, didn't walk away from empires built on violence and expect to survive. The syndicate would see it as weakness. Rival organizations would test him. The police might still come after him for decades of crimes that had no statute of limitations. But Michelle was looking at him with something that might have been faith, and Suk realized he would burn down every syndicate from Seoul to Lowe's Angels if it meant keeping that expression on her face. Okay, he said, one last time, then I build. The meeting with Choi happened 3 days later in a private room at a Korean restaurant in Koreatown, neutral territory monitored by the syndicate elders in Seoul via video conference. Choi arrived with his surviving soldiers, his expression confident because he believed Suk had overplayed his hand and had revealed himself to be too violent, too unstable to lead. Suk arrived alone, wearing a suit instead of tactical gear, and presented the elders with a proposal. He would step down as head of the American operations and transition to legitimate business, investing syndicate money in legal enterprises that would generate clean profit for decades. In exchange, he wanted complete autonomy over the Riverside projects and a formal decree that Michelle James was untouchable, harm her and face elimination from the entire syndicate. The elders deliberated for 6 minutes before accepting. Choi's attempted coup had shown weakness, and the factory massacre had demonstrated that Suk was too dangerous to eliminate without significant cost. Letting him go legitimate was the cleanest solution, a way to preserve profit while removing a volatile element from the criminal hierarchy. Choi's face when the decision came through was everything Suk needed: rage and impotent fury at being outmaneuvered not through violence but through politics. Suk smiled at him across the table and said in Korean, "Touch her and I'll kill you slowly. That's not a threat. It's a promise from the boy who survived your basement." 6 months later, the Riverside projects looked different. Not gentrified. Suk had been careful about that, understanding that displacement was just violence in a slower form. But improved. The buildings had been repaired, the infrastructure updated. A new community center offered after-school programs and job training. The local elementary school had received enough funding to hire additional teachers and buy new textbooks. City General Hospital had gotten a massive grant that expanded their emergency department and hired more staff. Michelle stood by the playground fence where Suk had nearly died 2 decades earlier, watching children play on new equipment that didn't have rust or broken parts. The fence itself had been replaced, the chain link upgraded to something safer, more secure. But they'd kept the same location, the same configuration. Because some landmarks deserved to be remembered. Suk approached from behind, his footsteps quiet on the new concrete. He'd traded his tactical gear for business casual, looked more like a tech investor than a former crime lord. The transformation wasn't complete, probably never would be, but he was trying. Michelle had to give him credit for that. "The contractor says the rec center will be finished by next month," Suk said, standing beside her at the fence. "Full basketball court, computer lab, music room, everything you asked for." "Everything the community needs," Michelle corrected. "Not everything I asked for. This isn't about me." "It's always been about you." Suk reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "From the moment you pushed that cornbread through this fence, everything I've done has been about you." Michelle's breath caught as he opened the box, revealing a ring that probably cost more than her nursing salary for 5 years. A single diamond that caught the afternoon sun and threw rainbows across the playground. It was beautiful and excessive, and so completely Suk that Michelle felt tears building behind her eyes. "I kept my promise," Suk said quietly. "I bought this whole block. I made it safe. I'm rebuilding it into something better, but none of that matters if you won't let me keep you too." Michelle looked at the ring, at the man offering it, at the playground full of children who were growing up in a neighborhood that was slowly, incrementally getting better. The system had failed them both, had turned Suk into a monster who thought violence was love, had turned Michelle into a martyr who burned herself out trying to save people the world had written off. They were products of poverty and neglect, and a society that created projects as containment zones rather than communities. But they'd survived, and maybe, against all odds, they could do more than just survive. "Ask me properly," Michelle said. Suk lowered himself to one knee on the concrete beside the fence where he'd once been dying, where Michelle had stopped when everyone else kept walking. "Michelle James, you saved my life when I was 9 years old with nothing but kindness and cornbread. You saw me when I was invisible. You cared when caring was dangerous. I've spent 20 years becoming someone worthy of that gift, and I know I've failed in more ways than I've succeeded. But I'm asking you to let me keep trying. Let me spend the rest of my life proving that the boy you saved can still become someone good. Marry me." Michelle pulled him to his feet, carefully mindful of his ribs that were still healing from the factory, and kissed him. It wasn't a gentle kiss or a romantic one. It was fierce and complicated and tasted like tears and hope in equal measure. "Yes," she said against his mouth, "but you have to promise me something." "Anything. Promise me you'll keep building. Every time you're tempted to solve a problem with violence, you'll remember that little girl who gave you cornbread instead of turning away. Promise me that the monster Seoul created will keep fighting to become the man I saw behind that fence." Suk slipped the ring onto her finger and held her hand like it was made of something precious and fragile. "I promise. Every day for the rest of my life, I'll choose building over burning. I'll choose you over everything else. That's my vow." They stood together by the playground fence while children played, and the Riverside Projects continued its slow transformation from war zone to community. The system had failed them both, had created the circumstances that turned a 9-year-old's kindness into a 20-year odyssey of violence and redemption. But they'd survived the failure, had found each other again despite everything designed to keep people like them broken and separate. And if two people who'd been chewed up by poverty and violence could find a way forward, could build something better from the ruins, then maybe there was hope for everyone else still fighting in the projects. Maybe the cycle could be broken. Maybe the story didn't have to end with another generation learning that kindness was weakness and survival meant staying silent. Maybe, just maybe, they could do better. The system failed them both, turning one into a monster and the other into a martyr. We tell these stories to remind us that we have to do better. Don't let the cycle continue. Subscribe to the channel and join our movement today.